Thank you. Welcome everybody. Welcome anybody watching to the Public Accountability meeting on the 22nd of May. We will, just before we start the agenda, we'll commit to taking a break at 2:30 to hold a minute silence in memory of the Manchester attack and victims and everybody affected. So we might stop midway through presentations or discussions or anything at 2:30. But on to the agenda, attendance and apologies. We'll go around and introduce ourselves for anybody watching who doesn't know. So I'm Will Naylor, Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for North Yorkshire.
Tom Thorpe, Policy and Scrutiny Manager for the PCC.
Good afternoon, Fraser Sampson, Interim CEO.
Claire Griffiths, Chief Constable's Chief of Staff.
Phil Kane, Assistant Chief Constable, Local Policing.
Alan Harder from North Yorkshire Police, Company Head of Safeguarding.
Hannah Hope, Policy and Scrutiny Officer, PCC.
Hello, Lisa Winwood, I'm the Temporary Chief Constable.
Thank you. We have apologies from Chief Constable Dave Jones, PCC Julian Mulligan, John Butford from Unison, and I think Rob Bowles from the Fed, given he isn't here, but he may turn up. On to item 2, which is the minutes. Anybody got any comments? I've got a couple of very minor typo type comments that I won't go through because I'll go through them separately. But there's an S missing from HMIC FRS. And a couple of other bits. But has anybody got anything substantial on the minutes that we can't just type up afterwards? No? Good. All the links are in place for anybody watching if you want to watch the last meeting. PAM actions. So, action 1. It's for Jenny, Alan, but I don't know if it involves the Offender Management Unit and a sort of, I don't know if review is the right word, but an understanding from the Local Criminal Justice Board where offender management best sits, which I think is not coming back for a couple of months yet, but is that underway?
Yes, there is a review has been completed. I've got a meeting later on this week with partners in probation and CRC to discuss the findings of that review.
Great.
To identify an appropriate way that those can be implemented in agreement with them.
Great.
And then if that is agreed, we'll then be putting a plan in place that we can put that in place.
Okay. I wonder that, not necessarily you, Alan, but if someone, maybe the ACC who's coming to the next meeting, can bring that update with them to know how those conversations go on and what the implementation plan might be.
I'll be able to update Mr. Kane, so he's got the full details
That
of,
would be great.
and that will include the timescales,
Thank you.
which
So,
will be presented to the BDI board. I think it's next month, isn't it?
yeah, and it's right it goes there first, but if the meeting coincides, an update here would be helpful, and then the public who are interested in that topic get that update. So we'll keep it open, but if an update for next month, that would be really helpful.
Is that on 221?
That's 221. Yes, sorry, 221.
Could we re-promote that?
Yes, why has Alan got the wrong? Yes. We'll check
Dropped
that.
in 2 ranks at the moment.
Yeah, gosh.
Serious.
See, a very old action.
I didn't know we'd got reduction and right back in.
Oh, yeah.
Right, yes, we'll clear that up. Apologies, Alan. The next 2 are closed. 224 is the next open action, which is that sort of wash-up of Operation Kingfisher, which I think is coming back in a couple of months' time once that sort of wider work's been done on both the policing of the operation itself, but some of the wider consequences of community impact and some other things. So we've got an update on Kingfisher today, but it isn't that, that's just the sort of monthly update that we've been having for the last year or so. So we'll keep that open. 225 is closed. 226 that has been updated for this performance pack, I think.
Yeah.
So we can close that now. That's it for actions. The only 2 open, we'll get an update on one next month and one the one after that, I believe. So that's agenda item 2 complete. Agenda item 3, questions from the public. Simon, I'm right to say we don't have any, aren't I?
No questions from the public.
Okay, so that was a quick agenda item. So, on to the meat of the meeting. Item 4 is our monthly thematic issue, which is today's stalking harassment. And Phil, are you doing an intro or is it straight to Alan?
Alan, I will hand it over to Alan.
Right.
Thank you. The presentation I'm going to give is in relation to stalking harassment, which was the request. I've listed 5 areas of discussion that I'll hopefully cover within the presentation as we go through. One relates to the definitions between, so we can try and explain what the difference is between harassment and stalking. Setting out what the national context is in relation to those 2 matters, the local context, and from those we'll be able to see what the challenges are that we face within North Yorkshire Police to try and police both of those and support the victims. And as a result of those challenges that we've identified, a number of actions that were put together to try and move forward in terms of the work that we've already done to take on to the next levels as well. So, and then at the end of the presentation, there's a section for questions as well. Okay?
Dare I say, Alan, there'll be questions in and amongst the slides as well, but but go on.
Okay, hopefully I will cover it all as we go through,
Yeah.
and we'll see where we go. Okay. So, in terms of harassment, that is what's been articulated in terms of what harassment is, and I won't read that out, okay? But it's important to note that harassment itself is not defined within the Protection from Harassment Act, and it's been determined by courts to include that physical, verbal and non-verbal conduct directed towards another person. And that conduct which is directed towards that person causes them to feel alarmed, distress, and in fear of violence. So an offender's behaviour in relation to that can include some criminal offences as well. So we might see somebody acting in an antisocial behaviour way towards a victim. There might be bullying, whether at work or in the school place, that could form harassment. Obviously, is the way that technology has advanced over years, we're seeing more offences taking place on the internet and internet-based offending. So that might be unwanted, abusive text messages, and we'll also get other people who might send gifts through the post to a recipient in the workplace as well, or at their home address. So in relation to harassment, that's where it would be.
Given that's such a wide definition, which I know is not a North Yorkshire Police definition, it is just the working definition, it covers, given it covers online, for example, and bullying potentially in schools, the remit is huge. There's two questions about that. One, do the police have to apply it in a sort of common sense way, or do the public, to a certain extent, manage their own view of what harassment is, and if it's bullying, the school will deal with it in a school context without needing to involve the police? Or do we need to be going out to sort of try and proactively sort of bring it in when it could well be harassment, but no one sees it as that, they are dealing with it as bullying? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I think that links into one of the points I was going to raise later on about identification of what it is.
We'll leave it there.
Okay.
So just in terms of schools, though, there's also the separate schools procedures that schools will follow, as opposed to us then going in and criminalising children.
Quite, and that's
Yeah.
sort of,
So there's a separate policy area for that.
quite, and partly what I'm getting at, cause so this could cover all sorts, you know.
Yes.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, if somebody does something to cause somebody them to feel afraid, or they are in that position where they're in fear, the offence is made out.
Mm.
And so is it enough for a victim, so if I come forward and say I feel distressed about these 2 or 3 things that have happened, is that in itself enough to count as harassment, the victim feeling those things, or does it require some objective view? A threshold of you know, is it reasonable to feel distressed at that happening?
Okay, it's around the victim. If that's the way that the victim feels, that the victim should report it. We can then investigate it and see whether or not that criminal offence is taking place. And I'd rather us investigate it as opposed to a victim go, they think it doesn't meet the threshold.
Yeah.
Because what the threshold is for one person may be very different for somebody else. And when you look at elderly victims, for example, they may be in greater fear by some people's behaviour than a younger person's, and it's trying to put in context and having a victim-focused approach to it, as opposed to just a simple threshold and it's not being reached.
I think there's a different distinction between something that meets the definition of a crime, so therefore we would record a crime in relation to it, and something that would meet public interest element for prosecution at court. So there are 2 different levels that apply to it.
Can I ask in relation to what you've both said there then, there is a lot more public awareness, I would say, of antisocial behaviour, or what is termed antisocial behaviour. Antisocial behaviour isn't a crime in and of itself. If an elderly person or any member of the public were to report that they felt that they were being targeted by antisocial behaviour, would the police proactively think Well, if they are, and they're saying that they're getting people coming back to them every week or every other night or something like that, would the police proactively go out and say, well, that might be harassment, let's look at it as harassment? Or would it actually need the member of the public to say, I feel like I'm being harassed?
And I think that's covered within the challenges that I'll come to.
Right.
Because if I could give an example of two boys playing football in the street and they bounce the ball off the gable end of a house. They may be just two boys playing football. For the elderly couple that may live in that house, they're hearing that flip of a ball every night. The difference would be is, are they intending that to be directed to upset the people in the house, or are they just two children playing football?
And
Okay.
there's a difference
And
between
that is the difference between antisocial behaviour, two people just playing football, or the deliberate, targeted, directed approach
Yeah.
to what harassment is. So my view would be, if the people report it to the police, we can understand what the people's concerns are, and then we can start to address those through that investigation of what it is that's happening.
So, for example, if a member of the public or a local business was getting young people throwing stones at the window on a regular basis because they knew that they'd get a rise out of that shop or bungalow or whatever it is, and they would call the police, and then if a PCSO or somebody would turn up and provide some attention or diversion for those young people, that would be with purpose to harass those people, would you suggest, or you'd have to look into it?
And what you
I'm
said
just
is-
trying to, because this is the complexity of it.
No, it is, and that's where that person's having that directed approach
Yeah.
to that person, and if that is to have them fear in relation to what they're going through, that is more targeted, which is what the harassment is about. But we still need to investigate that to try and find out what it is exactly that's been done.
Thank you.
And it is fairly complex in that there are certain circumstances. So I think there's a specific bit within the law, unless you tell me it's changed since. If you are a debt collector continually calling at somebody's house to lawfully recover a debt, that person can ring us up and say, I'm being harassed by this person, but they've got a lawful purpose to call at the address. So although they're saying, I deem this to be criminal harassment, in law it's recognised that person has a lawful purpose to call at that person's address.
So we often get accused of it, don't we, when we go around knocking to arrest an individual and they're not in. So we go around repeated times. We get accused of harassment, so we've got a lawful purpose to do what we're doing.
I see.
So it is fairly complex.
And then my last thing isn't a question, it's just a comment that I imagine this will be one of the larger areas of policing that has unreported cases. If you think the narrative at the moment of online harassment and being rude to people on Twitter or whatever people do on Twitter, which seems very targeted a lot of the time, could result in harassment, but people just don't report it, or they block people and deal with it in different ways. But the unreported scale would be massive.
Yeah, and we've also changed the manner in which we record harassment now recently as well. So I'll come on to the performance figures later on in the meeting.
Yeah.
So we anticipate a rise in recorded crimes in relation to harassment and stalking because we will record them much earlier than we have done previously. So we'll see that coming through, and also the education that we're giving to the officers. We'll come on to where we're seeing predominantly some of our public safety and welfare elements, calls for service revolving around harassment, stalking, and malicious communications area.
Thank you.
Sorry, could you just explain? So it says a course of conduct. Could you explain that?
Okay. A course of conduct is basically what happens on more than one occasion. So if it's repeated more than once. So actually, you, as an offender, you know it's going to have an impact. You continue to do that, and therefore that is the course of conduct.
But could it mean different activities?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if I know sending you a letter causes you that harassment, I then send you a text message, and I then send you some flowers, and I know that's going to cause you that harassment because you know it's come from me. That would be courses of conduct. So it doesn't have to be just singular and exactly the same.
So the easy way to summarise it is it can't be a one-off.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, and it has to be within a reasonable time period. So you can't have one taking place in January, another one taking place in December. That doesn't count necessarily as a course of conduct. Although that time frame is not defined in law, it has to be a course of conduct that follows a time frame, not a significant gap into it.
And that's the judgment of an investigator to
Yes.
understand it. Is
And
that a
within
reasonable
that,
time
in
frame?
conjunction with
Yeah.
CPS, it depends on.
So it's very context dependent. So if somebody contacted somebody on the anniversary of something on purpose, that could be a course of
Yeah.
conduct even though it's only once a year, because it's become
Yes.
something that they know causes that person some harm on that particular date of the year, for example.
Thank you.
Okay. In terms of stalking, the Living in Fear document that was produced in July last year does provide a better definition in terms of what stalking is. But stalking is often described as the mental rape by victims. The stalking is willful, it's malicious, it's repeated harassment of another person. That's threatening that individual's safety. People who commit these offences, the stalkers, don't generally follow the rules of civilization because of what they're trying to achieve. And because of that, that puts them at an advantage over their victims because they will step outside the boundaries that most people would follow in normal society. Stalking has some similar challenges in the same way that harassment does, okay? Because not all of the actions of the stalker have to be criminal, but some of them they might escalate to acts of violence. So a sort of stalking incident could range from somebody being assaulted on purpose by the person that's stalking them, but also somebody just sitting on a wall outside of a house, not a criminal act, but that person's always there when that person comes home, week after week, and actually that behaviour itself is then presenting a concern to the victim. That needs to be reported because actually that's the difference. So although not a criminal act, we need to know about it because it's putting that person in fear. It's a higher level of stalking with them. That's put that person at risk.
And again, there won't be a fixed answer to this, but can you be stalked after 2 or 3 occasions of something happening, or does it have to be into the 10s or 20s of?
No, I think very similar around stalking, around harassment, will be more than once. Okay, so if you've got those, 2 occasions that course of conduct, that would be the threshold in my mind, because if it's more than twice and it's caused you those concerns, it's right that you report it so we can investigate it, try and identify who that person is and the reasons for doing that. Because if we said it was only 10 times, actually, in my view, there's an element of risk increasing as we go through. The earlier we know, the sooner we can investigate and identify what it is to make sure that the victim's safe, and we can reduce the risk that perpetrator presents.
So it's largely the distinction between harassment and stalking about the behaviour and motive of the stalker or harassee.
In essence, yes.
And the more sort of aggravated it might be, or fixated, I think is a word up there.
That's it.
And just to go back on both, there are, not to confuse the public, but for my own benefit and for some of the slides in future, there are 2 stalking, there's section 2 and section 4, and they're not different crimes, or are they different crimes, but they're the same crime recorded differently? And same with harassment, are there two types of harassment, one less serious, one more serious?
It's in terms of the crime recording element to it and the parts to it.
Right.
Okay.
So with regards to harassment, one will be harassment with the fear of violence.
Okay.
So violence will be a great element of harassment,
Yeah.
one will be without any threat of violence.
Same with stalking. So, and we get onto some numbers later. Are they both types of harassment and both types of stalking? And you could break those down to which one, there might be much less serious harassment and much less serious stalking, but that distinction could be drawn out with some...
It could be, but it's actually just the top level of both of those numbers.
Yeah, fine.
So in terms of the types of perpetrators that we get for stalking, they are the 5 main headings that we have. The rejected is quite often a person that will pursue an ex-partner, hoping for that relationship to be rekindled or for vengeance. So that would be very much around a domestic related stalking incident, because there's a lot of crossover between domestic abuse, domestic relationships and stalking and harassment. Intimacy seekers, they're the people who believe that they are in love with the victim, and they will think that if they're able to approach the victim, that might be mirrored. So that might be where somebody's sending those gifts, a stranger sending somebody some gifts. We have the incompetent suitor, who is inappropriately intrudes on people, turns up at the wrong places at the wrong times, either at work or when somebody's shopping, to try and do that. We do have people who do it out of revenge, to carry out revenge on the victims, and there are a small number who take it as a predatory act in terms of sexual offending. And this is why it's really important that if people think they've been stalked, even after 2 occasions, that they contact the police so that we can make the appropriate inquiries around all of those to try and reduce the risk to any of the victims in relation to it.
A couple of questions at the back of that. One is, how do you use that information to affect how you investigate or deal with a crime or address a perpetrator? So if they are an intimacy seeker instead of a resentful person, does that change the process you then take as a police force to try and address that problem?
I think it depends at which point we identify the motive, because if we don't know what the motive is, we don't know what we're dealing with necessarily. So it's important that we identify who the offender is by that early reporting, early investigation and development. Then we can identify who the person is, because it might be somebody with some previous sex offending, which is important that we need to tackle that quickly, and we can do that through our public protection unit officers, or whether or not there's been that connection within a previous relationship. So we need to understand who the person is, and once we understand that, we can then put the appropriate plans, safeguarding plans in place around the victim, and then also around the reduction for the offender. So we do need to understand who that person is. Okay, so moving on to sort of the national picture, a national profile in relation to stalking shows that 76% of people, of ladies, of women who've been murdered nationally, had reported incidents of stalking in the previous 12 months, which is a very high number. And for 85% of those, they were murdered by their partner. So when I explain that this is very much connected to domestic related incidents, that is the context, that is very high.
And I know it's an unknown quantity at the moment, but one of your officers was at the same conference, but at the Susie Lamplugh Trust conference a few weeks ago I attended, the implication is there is as much self-harm and suicide on the back of stalking as there is homicide, in the sense that lots of low-level stalking might result in a victim taking action on themselves rather than an offender coming to do that. So there are the risk manifests in different ways.
It does, and we're seeing that nationally, unfortunately, around antisocial behaviour, in terms of where people have been victims of antisocial behaviour, and that's where they've turned to. So it's not just through people committing murders, it's people who risk themselves as a result of what they're going through, and it will affect people's mental health, understandably. We're talking about 75% of domestic violence stalkers will turn up the workplace. That's from Paladin, national charity who support victims for stalking and harassment. When we talk about 1 in 10 who've had no prior relationship with the victim, that is information that's come from the National Stalking Helpline. But I think we need to take into consideration around what that means in North Yorkshire. Those numbers of stalkers who do that in terms of unknown, which are low in terms of the context, and when we look at the numbers of stalking incidents in North Yorkshire across the force, again that's a small number, so percentage wise the likelihood of that is lower, just to make sure that people don't need to have that concern around the level of risk. But I'd still suggest that if people think they've been stalked, that they do report it.
And more so interestingly, the Susie Lamplugh Trust said 2 in 10, and then I know there's some forces taking a lot of action on stalking, and Sussex is one of those, and PTC won't mind me saying, because she said so in the national newspaper that she's been stalked, but in Sussex they did lots of work on this with victims and police station, all those things, and they had 3 in 10 of their stalkers were not known to the victim. So whether that's reflected or else, I've no idea. That could be a Sussex thing, but it would appear to be more than they'd otherwise have thought anyway.
And I think it's around better.
How many of those are cyber, where it's easier to sort of, that might manifest that more easily, but I don't know about that. But
And I think that's around better recording by some forces, better understanding in terms of when somebody reports it, I don't know who it is, and then the investigation continues, then they identify who it is, and at which point do you take that measure. Okay. In relation to the bullet point 4, that's come from the crime survey in England and Wales. Just to sort of put that into context, that's over 730,000 women and 388,000 men in England and Wales who are making stalking part of domestic abuse, okay? Which is an alarming statistic when you consider that only 412 people have been convicted in the 16-17 figures nationally. Okay, we've mentioned about cyber stalking a number of times. We've gone through that is increasing very quickly. Everybody's access to technology, the ability to create fake profiles, to follow people online, allows that to increase, and that's why we obviously want to make sure that people are very aware as to what they're doing online. Safety online, internet and safety, and that's why we continue being putting those messages around of actually, do you know who you're talking to? Is it a real person? Is it the person that you know, as opposed to just an internet name?
Forgive me, I'm just trying to do some maths here. So the crime survey in Wales would say about 5% of women have reported stalking, which in North Yorkshire would be 40,000. Got 800,000 residents. I just put it into some sort of scale and context. Should that be reflected in North Yorkshire? That's a lot. And we record, I don't know, single, triple, hundreds, in the hundreds, don't we, rather than thousands, let alone 40,000. Okay.
And I think going back to what you said, in terms of reporting, is it an area that's underreported? I think it is, because people have those different thresholds. Once you know what stalking harassment is, are you more likely to report it? I think you are. And that's part of the messages and community messages that we need to get out, we continue to put out, of report it, and then we can start to do something, because if we don't know, we can't do something.
And I suspect lots of those will be victims of another crime along the way, not all, but some might have suffered domestic abuse and other things, assault or whatever. So it's also the public having an understanding and feeling confident to come forward, and then police picking it up when it might be domestic abuse being reported, but actually there's stalking as well, but it's domestic abuse that's dealt with rather than the stalking element.
And it's how it comes in and how it's identified and how it's investigated. Because of stalking, cyber stalking is on the increase. That also has an impact around how we investigate in terms of recovery of electronic devices, the download of those, and the recovery of evidence as well that we need to do. And as the devices get bigger, the amount of time that is required to download those devices also increases, because we need to ensure that we capture everything because of the issues connected to disclosure, etc. Okay.
Just link back to that point about the figures though, thinking back to the CDI presentation that we had at the last public accountability, of course the rules have only just changed on the 1st of April about also recording stalking harassment. So if you remember, Trish was talking about if you report a series of offences, they only actually crime the most serious of those offences. So if somebody's involved in a domestically abusive relationship and they report a very serious act of violence, sexual offence, etc., alongside, and also this person's been bothering me on all of these occasions, it wasn't previously before the 1st of April. So although someone might tell the crime survey, I've reported stalking, because they actually have, if they've reported it at the same time as a course of conduct involved in a more serious crime, of course before the 1st of April it wasn't crimed as stalking and harassment, it was only crimed as the most serious
and I'm sure
element.
Yeah, of course, and hopefully some of those will be recorded as incidents, if not crimed per se.
So the data
but not
between
all still.
Sorry,
No,
the data between last year and this year will be really interesting then, won't it? So post 1st of April, the next 12 months, if we see, we'd expect to see, wouldn't we, a massive increase in stalking and harassment, because actually if there's an element of stalking and harassment in the vast majority of domestic abuse, for example, you'd expect to see from the 1st of April that reflected in our figures this year.
And if they reported 30 incidents by going through an historical statement with an officer, each one of those wouldn't have a separate incident created, so you still wouldn't have a true reflection of individual. It would be a course of conduct between a period of time.
But it's worth putting a performance marker down now,
Absolutely.
isn't it, as you've done there, because that you wouldn't want an increase in a recorded increase as being taken either as a necessarily a greater vote of public confidence in reporting, or worse, a great occurrence. I think it would be purely a CDI type, a foundation integrity type rise, wouldn't it? So we need to track that
Nexus are doing some work for me with Sarah's team and Trish's team around what that looks like, and that's potentially up to a 25% increase in recorded crime through the changes in what we're doing around CDI, and also the changes in legislation for burglary and for stalking and harassment, the way that we record crime. So it's up to a 25% increase.
And again, going back to CDI, it's important not only for a sort of transparency perspective, but to make sure victims, in particular stalking victims, get the best support they can. And I think the Commission is looking to improve that support if we possibly can. But so there's two elements. There's the knowing the problem, and there's also the person who's suffering from it, giving them the best support they can.
Sorry, well, in terms of clarifying that for the public viewers, and the point that Chief has made about the change in the rules, can you just explain what that change is? Is it under all circumstances where there is another crime accompanied by stalking or harassment, that will be recorded as well?
Yes.
It's not just certain types?
No. So pre the 1st of April, it was whatever the most serious, if a series of crimes was reported on one occasion, the most serious one, the principal crime, as Trish explained to us, was recorded. Post 1st of April, the change is that if there is an element of that series of crimes that's reported that is stalking and harassment, that will also track a separate crime. But so if somebody's burgled and they say this is linked to somebody sitting outside my house for months on end harassing me, that wouldn't normally have been recorded because the burglary would have been recorded as the more serious crime. Now there will also be a crime of stalking and harassment linked to that offence.
So, looking at the levels of stalking and harassment in North Yorkshire, as you'd expect, harassment is higher than stalking, and that takes us back to April 2014 and carries us through till February of this year. And importantly, I think we've also got there is the breach of orders that we've included, just to show in terms of when they've been identified and they get reported as well, which I think is important.
It is really interesting. And do you, you might on occasion, is there a sort of an approach to those breaches that, as I understand it, you can prosecute a breach but also stalking again? So if there's a number of breaches, you can prosecute those breaches as well to go, right, well that's a course of conduct as well, and we'll tag stalking on to it.
And that's the approach I believe that we should be taking, okay? Because if somebody continues the same course of conduct towards that same victim, it's not just a breach of the order, it's continued harassment. Obviously that is the decision by the Crown Prosecution Service, not North Yorkshire Police in terms of charge decisions. But in terms of doing that, that's what officers should be raising when they seek the advice from CPS of additional charge for harassment and the breach of the order. So it's two, because that harassment is continued, and I think that's the way it should be proceeded with.
Is the implication being that's not necessarily done at the moment as a matter of course? It might be by officers who are particularly sort of adept at that, in that piece of legislation or that area of business, but won't necessarily be in the front of people's minds.
I think it's probably part of a national issue in terms of one or the other, and I think that's work that we need to do with CPS, and that's some work that we've got internally to look at of actually where are we with that to make sure that we are covering too.
I think it's also got to be seen how the courts receive it, because put somebody before a breach of an order, so there's potential for them to receive a punishment in relation to that. And then we're also then saying actually we're also putting you forward for an harassment as well. So I think we need to understand how the courts would receive that element of putting that case across, as whether that's seen as actually having two bites of the cherry here.
And does that also get captured by the changes in legislation around recorded crime? So if your breaches you think amount to stalking, whether CPS want to take that forward or not, but do you record, will you have to record stalking following a couple of breaches? Does that make sense? Does that apply to...
So do you end up with 2 crimes?
Yes.
The actual
So-
harassing behaviour and the breach of the harassment
Yes.
order?
Under the
Or
new
would that be
legislation.
seen as double counting?
The breach of the order, I need to double check because I wouldn't want to give you
No,
or the
that's
public
fine.
the false
Trish will know
information.
though, won't
No,
she?
but
about
Well,
what's
I
double
thought would be
counting?
the breach of the order wouldn't be necessarily the crime. It would be an occurrence because it's an order.
I see. So you wouldn't have to necessarily tag stalking because it's not a crime, it's an occurrence.
Well, I'd need to double check,
Sure.
and I can take that away if you'd like me to give you that clarity. But I
Yes.
don't think we
That'd be great.
necessarily.
It'll be in that big book.
Yes, yeah, the
If
one we
somebody
slammed on the table
breaches-
last time, yeah.
What
Well,
do
It is
you
an
recall?
offence, isn't it? So can I just, it says levels within North Yorkshire. Those are convictions.
No,
Or
they
those
are
instances or,
they're
charges or-
instances
okay.
taking place.
So reported instance, so that's when people have reported it
Yes.
and it's been recorded as an incident of.
Either stalking or harassment.
Yes. So what,
So that might not show where people have. Does that face the same challenge that people may have reported something else as well, and therefore,
Okay.
Pre-April,
yeah,
yes.
yes, yeah, okay.
sorry, so the point my asking now is because that's a very important distinction in the court process and
Yeah,
prosecution is where it goes. But on some of those occasions, perhaps quite a few you'd hope, the intervention of the police may well have dealt with
Yes.
the issue. Therefore, you know, the person who is doing, let's say, the lowest end, kicking the ball against the wall, they say, I had absolutely no idea.
Yeah.
Well, once you've had a visit, they're now in no doubt, are they, that
Yes.
that behaviour is being regarded as harassment. And if they don't do it again, it's exactly what the legislation was intended for.
And it would
Isn't
be an ASB incident.
Yeah.
If they then, knowing that it's causing harassment and distress to the people
They
in the
do it
house,
again.
continue to do it, it
Yeah.
should become a crime of harassment, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
Because they're then intentionally doing it because of they're trying to seek revenge on the fact somebody's reported them playing, for example.
Yeah. But they're almost, I mean, for me, they're more helpful, the figures, if they're not purely about the number of occasions where enough things
Yeah.
coalesce together to produce a conviction. Because a lot of those are outside
That's
your
right.
control.
Yes.
And they're not necessarily individual incidents either, because if you've got to have a course of conduct of 2 or more,
Yeah.
so you potentially will have 2 occurrences that then create one crime of
Of course,
Yeah.
of conduct.
harassment.
Yeah.
So again, it's a really
Yeah.
tricky area to work through.
So a certain number of those crimes might be reflected in the ASB figures that we'll
Yeah.
see later in the meeting, potentially, for example.
So in theory, could you have occasions where there's been breaches of an order of harassment, at which point it could then, if there's been several breaches, then trigger a review to go back and think, well actually maybe this is more significant and signifies obsessive behaviour, for example, and then it becomes stalking.
There is, and can I give you the answer to that later on? Okay, because that links in with some of the updates that we've got from the national direction.
Sure.
Which I think is really positive. Well, that's a really important point, and I'll bring that out.
Can I just ask about pins at this point?
No.
Right.
I'm going to ask about things.
Oh, okay.
I'm just for Evie taking notes. Just an action to come back then on A, the recording practice of breach,
Yeah.
and if you have to then record a stalking element, and anything else that comes up in that sort of thought process around. Are we double recording things? Not that there might not be a way around that, but just to
No, no.
understand sort of
What's
in
the
the round.
standard?
Yeah.
If Trish is watching this, she'll be shouting
Yes,
at
I
the
know.
television. Yeah,
Just slamming her big book on the table.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, looking at the recorded levels of stalking harassment within York and North Yorkshire between 2013 and 16, 17, because I've gone for crime years, because obviously for the complete years. That shows the breakdown for those across the force. In terms of areas where they occur, York, Scarborough and Harrogate, I've got the largest numbers of reported stalking harassment, and the rural areas having the smaller numbers, the least.
Which
Fitting
would
in with the
that reflects our view of domestic abuse being much less reported in rural areas than
Yes.
urban areas.
Okay. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, when we looked at those figures in the national picture, 3/4 of the perpetrators for both stalking and harassment were male, and that's the same for across all those years. And 15% of those perpetrators have been linked to 2 or more offences, which shows that repeat and going back to offending, and that's the way that they commit their crimes against victims. Okay. And within that, 6 of those perpetrators have offended in at least 3 of the 5 years that have been analysed. So it's not just a short period of time, it's continued offending over a long period. Now, when that's towards one victim, if that's a sustained campaign of stalking and harassment towards an individual, that's got a significant impact against the victim. And that's where those victims, we need to make sure they get the best possible support from us and support agents to make sure that they are.
I agree, and that's the sort of case I had in mind where did the breaches amount to more stalking? So I've got a particular victim in mind who, I won't go into too much detail, but breaches are coming forward, and I just wonder if that's being accounted as stalking again, or you're just looking at the breaches, because that, again, the support the victim might get might change if recorded in a different way.
Yes.
Forget the sort of mechanics of how it's recorded in the sort of control room at the moment. What's the process when something is recorded as stalking, specifically rather than harassment, at NYP? What's the process that then follows? Where does it go to a specialist team? Are they not specialists?
Okay.
All that, but the sort of process of investigating.
So when the report's received in the control room, an officer will be identified to attend. The grading of that would depend on whether or not the victim's available and how quick a response is needed.
Sure.
But the officer will go, they will speak to the victim, they will listen to the details and identify whether or not it is stalking and harassment, or perhaps it's ASB, so that they can make that assessment. If it is identified as being stalking or harassment, the officer should complete.
How do they identify whether it's stalking or harassment?
They will be able to do that through the training and the knowledge and the experience that they've got. In relation to when they've had their initial training as police officers, and part of the subsequent training that we delivered.
It's about applying the points to prove within a piece of legislation. So they would know the definitions that Alan has gone through, and i.e. the course of conduct, 2 or more occasions, causing harassment, alarm or distress. So they will go through those individual parts as points of proof. So as a victim portrays their account, the officer's thinking through their mind actually which bits of legislation is this ticking off, and therefore it fits stalking, it fits harassment, whichever area it might come.
And I'll explain this to the public in a minute. I'll ask the question first. At this point, are they doing a dash, or does that come later? A dash is a domestic abuse.
So at that point, they should complete the dash. Now, the dash that we refer to is the domestic abuse and stalking harassment. So
It's
even
a
if
form,
it's
a list of questions.
It's just a list of questions which are based around who the victim is, whether or not the perpetrator is known, and it has a number of questions that are in it which allow a risk assessment to be made around that specific that case. Okay, so the risk assessment will grade things as high, medium, low if it was a domestic incident, for example. High, medium, or standard, and it also comes out with a score, just to be able to put some context around what is being reported. That dash, this domestic abuse, stalking and harassment form, then goes through to our domestic abuse coordinators, because I think they're probably the most appropriate people to receive them. It fits in with the connections to domestic abuse, and then they are reviewed. But they're also reviewed by supervisors as well as they go through that process to be quality assured, so that we can make sure that everything's recorded and risk assessments are in place.
So a few questions on the back of that. Do those domestic abuse specialists, for want of a better word, have specific training in stalking as well as domestic abuse, or are they applying their domestic abuse training, which might well be very similar to the potential case of stalking they've got?
Okay, they are not specifically trained in respect of stalking and harassment. They are applying their knowledge and understanding around domestic abuse, obviously the correlation, safety victim plans to make sure plans are in place to safeguard the victim. I think there is scope in the future to ensure that those people have an enhanced level of training over and above what we've already delivered, over and above what we've already done around toolkits, and awareness of stalking harassment, because actually the more you know about it, the more you understand about it and the context of it, actually you're better informed then to do something about it.
Yeah.
So these aren't investigating the crime. These are safeguarding. So the DASH risk assessment is about identifying where the risks are around an individual and looking at what safeguarding plans and referrals need to be put in place. So the domestic abuse coordinator is coordinating that safeguarding response. They are not carrying out the investigation. So the investigation will go to a trained investigator.
Trained in stalking.
Well, yeah, they're trained in. If it's a what we call a PIC level 2, a complex case, it will
Yeah.
go to a detective that's trained. So the detectives are trained in a number of complex case.
Sure. I just know
Yes.
from elsewhere. So at that conference, there was a workshop with Hampshire and Cheshire, who were part of a police transformation fund thing. So for the public and
They're
national
piloting.
fund. Yeah, they're piloting. But Hampshire been doing it since 2012. So some of it's new, some of it's not new at all. But they train a number of their detectives in a Australian program, SRP or SPR, stalking SRP. But they have a quite enhanced training. It's a couple of day course, not cheap either, I don't think, but they say it is worthwhile. And they're not only do they deal with the cases that come to them, but they also are sort of a triage unit. I think a bit like the fraud team are. If a cop is unsure as to what to do next, or is this stalking, or I need to understand this better, there is a pool of highly trained stalking specialists to be able to sort of advise at an early stage, receive the paperwork if they need to, have a look at it in detail, send it back. They then got stalking clinic, which I might talk about later, but they have a pool of specially trained people to deal with stalking in particular, rather than domestic relationship issues that might manifest in a number of different ways, including stalking. So they are specifically trained. That's my question, which ours aren't at the moment. Is there do we feel a need to? Is it in a plan to do that?
There's, within the next steps, I'll answer your question now. Within the next steps, and I think you've been invited to it, is a workshop around stalking harassment to bring some of the investigators together, the OPCC's office within that, and also myself and one of the others around who's the planner on stalking harassment in the force, to actually identify which are the best ways forward, because there's been a national conference around stalking harassment.
Yeah.
There was a national conference last week around stalking harassment, which was organised within the Metropolitan Police that we went to. That's produced some guidance from the Home Office along with CPS. So actually the timing to have a workshop in force around stalking harassment and how we can develop the service that we give to the victims is probably timely to be able to do that. In relation to the national best practice, I know that we're going to go to Cheshire to go and see what they have in place there. So bringing all that together and the time of that meeting that's taking place in the middle of next month is the right time to do that. If that then identifies there's a need for an enhanced level of training for a couple or some officers, I think that's something that I can take then to Mr. Kane as a proposal in terms of this is a gap, this is what we have, and we might be able to fill that to improve the service that we're giving to victims. And that's why we've organised that workshop. Now we've got everything together time-wise.
Again, a couple more things. So one, there's different types of training. So there's specialist, I think, training. I think the SRP thing, which is quite specialist for investigators. But there's also, I think, wider training available now. Don't know if it was sort of made in-house or there's some, it's sort of sourced from Paladin or Susie Lamplow or those kinds of charities. But Sussex, for example, implemented training in their control room for awareness purposes. So you might be being told things without the word harassment or stalking cropping up, but you know, my ex-partner's been visiting or whatever, that aren't always, well, certainly historically, it might have changed recently, aren't necessarily then taken forward as stalking. And the advice might not be brilliant. Sussex went from something like 45 cases in 2014 to 1,000 recorded cases in 2016, because of the awareness at the recording stage, which then got sent through to those specialists, and you know, it sort of then it snowballs from there. And equally have not just Sussex, some of those other forces we mentioned, enhance their dash with an S dash. So when it gets to the stalking question, if there's even a slight flag of stalking or harassment, there's another whole set of questions that are stalking specific that again pull out the risk, and then that safeguarding kicks in a slightly different way again. But it's just sort of another layer of detail and understanding that is in those forces, I think, that we might not have at the moment.
Certainly the domestic abuse stalking and harassment reform that we use, there are some questions, and if the answers are yes to those, you are taken to the risk assessment for stalking and harassment, and that's very clear that needs to be followed. So if it's initially reported as harassment, we go to that section, but if they go through the domestic abuse element and there's a yes to some of the risk and questions, actually you need to go and complete the stalking and harassment, and that reflects the correlation between domestic and stalking and harassment, so that's very much in place already in force. I think the difference of it now is now we've got the new crime recording, because we might be going for a domestic incident and we've now identified the stalking, that's where we'll get that additional crime recording.
You know that, and I'm sorry I don't know the answer to this, but the pilot in Cheshire then, is that involving the whole of the local criminal justice process? Because there's no point doing one bit of it, is there, if actually the CPS are not on board with the charging, if the courts are not on board with actually dealing with the...
It's a really, really interesting piece of work. So Cheshire and Hampshire have been doing it the longest. They met at the third, and those three have got national policing funding to sort of take it forward and academically test it and all that stuff. But Hampshire and Cheshire have a thing called the Stalking Clinic, which is what we're going to go to Cheshire to talk about, where they have clinical psychologists, primary care, probation, CPS, CAFCAS if necessary, if children are involved. The most sort of rounded group and those specialist trained officers as well from safeguarding or offender management. And importantly, they have a stalking specific victim service as well, not just an IDAS, but a stalking specific service who are also there. And they also feed in cases, so it won't just be police cases, they can come from anywhere, even primary care, and where they think that group can add the most value, so not all stalker cases by any means, but the ones that are either high risk or complex or whatever, go to that stalking clinic, which is once a month. They get about an hour per case, and they talk through those cases and what each partner can do. So the psychologists look at that slightly hardened perpetrators, what do they look like their behaviour might escalate to, if at all, and they have their rounded approach, and takes actions away, comes back, feeds into that next steps process. So yes, in short, there is the whole partnership approach to that.
And it's just generally this is people's behaviour, isn't it?
Yeah.
And punishment isn't going to change that person's obsession with behaving in that way, as we know from some of the cases that we've discussed. And therefore the court process also has to be part of that process, doesn't it, of the right sanction.
It does.
That is a sanction that is more about behavioural change in that person rather than a punishment.
Absolutely, and I was at a domestic abuse specific, so stalking wasn't really on the agenda conference last week in Newcastle, where the government are doing a consultation at the moment on domestic abuse. It didn't quite come up, but one of the proposals in that consultation is that orders can have, as well as just having restrictive behaviour, they can have behaviour that they have to undertake, like perpetrator programmes.
Absolutely.
The challenge with that I've fed back is that often that might be in an order from a judge, but I know cases where an offender's refused to do it and they get taken back to court and the judge says, okay, don't do it, do this instead, which might be community service of a longer period or more intensive. And even though the court process is sort of at one, it then falls down at a later stage anyway. So it is really complex and there's no straightforward response to that. But yeah, the government's certainly looking at those sort of proactive orders that perpetrators will have to do something to amend their behaviour, but fundamentally if someone doesn't agree that their offending is criminal or whatever, they refuse to take part, and it is difficult to make them do anything. So to a certain extent that works, but you do then come up against a challenging process.
Because this is the prevention element of the continuing to service a demand that actually we want to prevent the thing happening in the first place. Anyway.
I think to do that it's got to be multi-agency.
Absolutely.
Because some of it might be health issues or mental health issues, but those people need that additional support.
I'll just put your notes down and we'll stop in a couple of minutes for the
Okay. And that's just in terms of a breakdown of the previous slide, in terms of the victims for stalking harassment, whether or not the male or female over a period of time. I think that clearly shows the vast majority of the victims are female, which fits within the national picture of where we are before.
Can I just ask, is that because men don't report it? or because it is a crime perpetrated by men on women more prominently? Or don't we know because the crime recording rules have just changed?
I think it's hard to say. I'm confident enough, a bit like domestic abuse, but definitely men will be underreporting, but I'm confident enough to say the majority of crimes, reported or not, will be men offending against women. Possibly not as high as some of the sort of national or local stats would say, because men probably report less often, comparatively, but I think there's enough sort of academic research done that generally speaking it is men that offend against women in domestic type crimes. There's also men on men stalking and domestic abuse and female on female, so it's certainly not a one-way street, and it's complicated. But
no, but those figures are quite stark, aren't they? Yeah.
Just looking at the levels across the county, these are it's the combined stalking and harassment numbers, just broken down for each of the commands. So for any of the people that are watching, that's the level where they've been in the respective areas where they may have lived across the county.
Which can imply, as per domestic abuse sort of understanding we have, that it's reported less in rural areas, that there is potentially particular awareness raising we need to do either with the officers who are dealing with issues in those areas and the public, so they understand what stalking harassment is. And by no means does it solve the problem, but it might mean we can focus some effort in some areas over than others, because I can't imagine population-wise Richmond should be that different to Hambleton.
No. And one of the things that we're looking in support of that this year at the Great Yorkshire Show, for example, when the police stand there, is we're going to have some of our domestic abuse officers there.
Yeah.
So actually people can go and speak to them, and they will be able to provide that advice around domestic abuse, but also stalking and harassment, to make sure that we get that message out to those, because I'm conscious that a lot of the people that will be going to the Great Yorkshire Show, for example, will be rural based.
Yeah.
And actually we just want to make sure that we share that message with our communities across the county.
Thanks. I'll stop there just for a few seconds till we reach 1:30, but when we do, in not too distant future, we'll just take a minute to remember the victims and families and anyone traumatised by the events in Manchester a year ago, but we'll I'll wait till my laptop clicks over to TVs. Yeah. Okay, we'll take a minute silence, please. Everybody, and it's just worth saying for anyone who's watching who was caught up in those events or family members were, we have a supporting victim service in North Yorkshire that are helping some of those who were caught up in the event actually, and those services are still available for anyone who thinks they need any help in that respect. Thanks, Alan.
So the next slide shows the levels of stalking harassment in North Yorkshire over the last 12 months. Okay. In terms of the stalking, I just want to focus on that element within this slide really. There's been the total of 76 incidents across the county in that time. It's important that when we look at the data, just being able to draw any inferences or hypotheses about where they've come from and what it's about. Okay. At the moment, our systems are designed to facilitate the collection of data, so the information is going in to inform and manage the policing activity around that investigation, and it's not always intended the way that the data goes in is intended to support research and analysis. So in terms of getting some of that information out, to make sure that we can get some of the greater understanding around, is it domestic related, is it strange related, the systems aren't designed for that, but we are actually able to get the information out and do a longer process and go through that. So of that 76 incidents of stalking, and that's defined by the victim of stalking, the 50 of those have been domestic related. 12 of those have been from acquaintances, 3 have been through neighbours, 1 through the workplace, and 9 have been a stranger. So in terms of those numbers that we mentioned earlier on, it's a smaller number in terms of that. Okay.
Neighbours is an interesting one. I suspect, again, if you sort of take the definitions at face value, there's probably a number of neighbour disputes that fall within that kind of level of harassment, and it's complicated. I know neighbour disputes can be extremely challenging, but because they're forced together, it might not necessarily appear as stalking, but if someone is peering over the fence every 5 minutes, or checking posters in your post, all sorts of ways to sort of, it might manifest that might still be dealt with as a neighbour dispute, but might be slightly more sort of aggravated than that potentially.
Definitely, and I've certainly investigated a neighbourly dispute as harassment successfully, which resulted in both husband and wife being convicted, and that eventually actually went to Crown Court on an appeal because they appealed the conviction, and they received an increased sentence on the back of that. So, neighbourly disputes, they do fall within that definition in terms of what's happening, and it's us having that understanding of how we're going to deal with that.
And again, for the public, niche is the system the police use generally to sort of record crime and things. Is there, niche is not in North Yorkshire Police's remit to change, there's a whole national complexity around that, but I know at the conference it was flagged up whether it's possible in future to, for example, flag someone as being convicted of stalking, so should they crop up in future, doesn't mean they're stalking again, but it just gives you that officer an immediate background to say, it might be worth noting the previous cases this person has been involved with, a bit like some of those policies on domestic abuse perpetrators being, you can share information with the public about that. Not within our gift, but something just to sort of think about potentially.
You mean about making a disclosure or reflecting?
No, well, I don't, disclosure I think is not within the powers at the moment, but flagging it as a for future
investigations.
cases, yeah.
With our niche, our record management system, everything's on there. Of course, that also then gets loaded onto the police national database. So other police forces can see that in the occurrences in the intelligence. And if someone's been convicted of it, it'll be on PNC as well, police national computer, in terms of those convictions. So those details will be available for any future investigations in relation to that, which is, I think, is important to make sure that memory of that offender isn't lost. Okay, so in terms of challenges, I think as we've discussed around the different types of scenarios that we might have, it's an awareness and an understanding of the different offences that take place. Is it ASB? Is it a criminal offence? Is it stalking? Is it harassment? And one of the areas that we need to do is improve around the crime data integrity that the Chief Constable has mentioned about, in terms of that crime recording, identifying the offences and recording those properly. Okay. We've talked about data abstraction. At the moment, the domestic abuse stalking harassment form is paper-based. So when that gets scanned and put onto niche, we can't always pull the details out of it. But now we're moving to mobile data. There are data fields that we will be able to abstract, so we'll be able to get more accurate information out of that. Quicker time around the incidents, the type of incidents, where they're occurring, and the relationship between victim and perpetrator. So we can put better plans in place that we already have in place to try and do that, which is going to be a positive. We talked about the -253. It's making sure that people understand what they're dealing with, stalking and harassment, and then once they've identified that, completing that form, because that's the start of that process, to safeguard the victims through the domestic abuse officers, who are those experts around protecting victims whilst the investigator continues with the investigation. So that's where we're at. And it's also important, I think, to make sure we've got the right level of support around victims. You've mentioned that's something that the PCC is looking at. Certainly, IDAS provide that support to victims of domestic-related stalking and harassment, but there hasn't been any around for the non-victim-related. So when we come across those incidents where it's not domestic-related stalking and harassment, they get referred to the national charities such as Paladin for that advice and support.
There's also some, I think North Yorkshire will benefit from it in the 7 Force collaboration on, or 6 Force collaboration on domestic abuse anyway, but
Yes, there is.
there's some, Northumbria were at the conference in Newcastle, obviously, talking about some of their practice in this, and not, they were related to domestic abuse and restraining orders, but I don't see why it couldn't apply to stalking. Rather than, I think some offenders are GPS tagged and restraining orders to not let them within a mile or whatever of the victim's home, had negative consequences on victims, and then feeling they have to stay at home, so they couldn't go to town anymore because actually they might meet them there because that's not within the restraining order. And they've been using something called proximity tags, where the victim also volunteers to wear something or have something on their phone, and they can go then about their daily lives, and they know if their GPS system and the offenders come within certain distance to each other, they get flagged up in the sort of control room, and they can make contact with the victim to say, you're safe, but just to let you know, you might want to go home because your offender's in close proximity. Lets them go about their daily life rather than feel like they're stuck at home because that's the only safe place. So there's some interesting things out there that might really help manage offenders potentially, but support victims in coping and recovering and get back on with life where possible.
Can I
It's
just
really
ask
interesting
about that then? So the example you've just given, this is about alerting the victim to say, you might want to go home now.
Yes.
What about the perpetrator?
Don't know. So Northumbria Police did a presentation of they've done 3 different approaches to domestic abuse that are all slightly different because some focus on perpetrators and some on victims. But one of the things, just a bullet point really, was their use of proximity tags. So she explained roughly what it would work with. Didn't say what they did with the perpetrator, just that it meant the victim felt able to leave their home, and they had really good feedback from victims. How they managed the offender, I don't know.
It'd be really interesting, I think, to have a look at it, because you'd have to have it on a voluntary basis for both parties.
Yes, it was all voluntary,
You then have to be, I would imagine, just thinking through, you have to be really careful that you're not reliant on the technology to say the perpetrator was or was not in the area, should a subsequent investigation take place where there's an allegation. So that just means you've left your phone at home as opposed to you weren't in the area.
Sure,
So,
and no doubt it'll be more complex than I've just sort of, and they only gave an outline as well, but it is, I think she seemed to imply, the inspector giving the update, might not be an inspector, I think she was an inspector, that it was part of the 6 Force collaboration. It was one of those things they're sharing as part of that. So
it'd be really interesting to have a look at.
might be that.
Can I just ask a question? Sorry, we talked about how stalking and harassment sort of facilitated on cyber and how that's increasing. Are there any particular challenges that presents?
In terms of the capturing of the evidence, that's one element to it, because if we need to go back to the person that provides the social media platform, that might be in another country, so we need to make those requests to secure that evidence. So another way to do that is to get a victim's mobile phone, download the mobile phone, then keep that in an evidential format. So that could be a challenge because some victims might not want to hand over their mobile phone. Now, we've seen reported in the news over a number of months actually what else is in the phone. That becomes really important during disclosure in a criminal investigation. Probably more so when it's domestic related as well. So some victims might not want to hand it over, because it takes so long for us to download the phone, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It will be triaged, it will then go into a queue because we've got other investigations ongoing. So if we were to ask the victim, can we have your phone for 4 weeks because we need to download it, there'll be a lot of reluctance, and I'm sure even in this room we might be reluctant to hand our phone over for 4 weeks. The other side of it is by doing that, we've actually taken away some safety support, so that's something else that we do consider. If we're going to take a phone, we give them one in return so that they can still contact the police and get help and support, and there's some specialist phones that we've got and equipment that we can do that.
So it's also what social media platforms they use as well, isn't it? So
It is. So
it presents different.
WhatsApp, for example,
some delete automatically.
Yeah.
Some Facebook apps communications delete automatically as well. So it depends how is it being received and in what format and how do we get it back.
Does the same apply to offenders' phones?
So offenders' phones are a little bit easier, in as much that if we arrest somebody and we're looking to secure and preserve evidence, we've got a power under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act to seize items that might hold evidence to prevent it being destroyed. So we can seize that phone under base and then we can seize that, have it examined and retain that during the course of the examination. But that comes around actually around victims, what the victims want, because they obviously could be victim focused as well.
Can I just ask, and for clarification for the public as well, a lot of people think that taking a screenshot of the incident, or the message or whatever that might constitute is enough. My understanding is that that's not always the case. Sometimes we've had instances in the office of people phoning up, they've taken screenshots of an online forum. The messages, because they've then reported them to the online forum have then deleted them, so the evidence isn't there at a later date. What is the best way for members of if say it is an online forum, that is where the evidence is, should they take a screenshot? Should they report it? Should they notify? What should they do to make sure that the evidence can be secured?
Okay, that's a really good question. Okay, because I think it comes down to what is the content. Okay, in that online forum, if that online forum is identifying the victim, I think if it's identifying the victim's family and it increases the risk towards it, if we're trying to reduce the risk, it's probably better to take a screenshot and ask for it to be taken down, because that's what we're trying to do, is reduce the risk towards victims and their families. Does that present some investigative challenges for us? Yes, it does. But we go back, what are we trying to achieve at the very beginning? It's to safeguard people and protect them. If that means we've got an investigative challenge later on, we've achieved our primary aim, which is where I go. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it's good to know that that is the current position, because we've had an instance in the past where somebody's been in touch because they did exactly that, but then the police, the North Yorkshire Police, unfortunately refused to investigate it because they said that they didn't have the evidence that was necessary to actually investigate what was being alleged properly, because there was only a screenshot of the
and the screenshot is there's the basis for that, and there's some work that can be done in terms of whose profiles are being used to put which comments on. The investigation can still continue. It just perhaps makes it a little bit more difficult, but that doesn't present an excuse to me. If it's difficult, we can still do it. It just might take a little bit longer, and we might need to do some more investigation to achieve the same end result.
I think this essentially a lot of this comes back to enhancing the training and the awareness around the offences and how to deal with them. Because
I think this case was at least a year ago now, so it's good to know that.
So for me, it's a case of actually there has been a previous method of providing warning. If the warning is taken heed of, then that's it. Then we don't record a crime and we don't go forward with the investigation. Actually, so that's changed completely now. However, what we need to do is make sure that the training that's been given through Alan's area of business to our front line takes that forward and embeds that and keeps that going. I think, and that's the bit for me. There needs to be lots of emphasis around that.
In terms of the technological evidence grab, that it sat behind your question, Tom. One of the things that the Commissioner asked us to do was to go and look at Durham and where they put their training and some of the investment, because what Durham Police have done is recognise that the people who will probably have the earliest fleeting opportunity to lock the thing without it in real time, rather than just a screenshot, will be the control room staff getting the first complaint. And whether it's social media related or even internet enabled element of stalking harassment, what they've done is they've trained a significant number, might even be all of their control room operators, in how to take the link and drop it into a system that they've already bought, which the CPS and other agencies can later use, because it's the first and fastest opportunity for anyone to do that, and after that it's too late, and then you just stuck with a one-dimensional screenshot, which we know has got limited evidential But Durham have bought that software and have put a significant number of their staff through it. Now, within the Evolve, which, as we know, for the sake of the public, is the three Durham, Cleveland, and North Yorkshire Police. That would seem to be an area that we could explore fairly quickly and cheaply further. But it was a very impressive and practical approach that they've taken, given that they've invested and they've paid for this software. I think it's from a Scottish company. It's there, but it's actually focusing who can get the most from that training rather than where we get it.
Which is interesting, isn't it? I suppose, and that'll be a great help. What it doesn't do is help with those phone-based messages, I guess, where you can't go on a computer to find unlike Facebook, a group or something on Facebook where you can freeze in time that and save it. Things like Snapchat, I assume the advice will still be screenshotted because there's no other way.
Yeah,
It's going to go otherwise.
It's going to go otherwise.
Yeah.
But just linking to crime and the identifications of crime, there is some training that's going out to develop people's understanding and knowledge around malicious communication and harassment, and that's part of the CDI work that we mentioned earlier on as well.
I suppose it's partly to do with investigations. Are you able to break down, not today, I said you won't have the figures with you, I can't imagine, but how many of the stalking cases we have recorded are Section 2 and Section 4? Because that would imply, not necessarily understanding, but obviously with Section 4 come powers to do searches, which if officers aren't aware that exists as an option very well, they won't go to Section 4 and then they can't use the powers and then evidence what's going on. So it's just sort of that understanding to know they're using all the options available, really.
I can get that breakdown in terms of those numbers, if that's going to help. But I think that comes back to one of the points that I will raise later around what we have been doing to increase people's knowledge around it. So, in terms of where the movement is nationally, earlier on this year there was the second reading of the Stalking Protection Bill. We expect that might come into place next year, hopefully. We've been waiting for the approved professional practice from the College of Policing. College of Policing are the body around professional investigation, how we conduct ourselves in certain areas of policing, and they have been reviewing the national guidance around stalking harassment. So I think Tom had mentioned earlier on around PINs, the Police Information Notices, or harassment warnings that some people have referred to them before. There's been lots of discussion on should they be used, should they not be used, the benefits of them and the impact, how perpetrators should be dealt with, searches, and a professional guidance around that has been made.
Is there any inkling as to their view on PINs and HINs? So I happened to be sat at the table with Cleveland and Northumberland officers at this meeting last week, neither of which use PINs or HINs anymore, and I know there's confusing national advice on PINs and HINs. My own personal view, for what it's worth, not the Commissioner's view, probably, might be, is PINs shouldn't be used because I think they're fraught with difficulty and for lots of different reasons. But can you explain why North Yorkshire Police do continue to use them under the sort of unclear advice from national counterparts? Because HMIC I think said don't, and then the College of Policing or NPCC said you can, but be careful with them.
Okay.
And then North Yorkshire Police do use them, some forces don't use them.
I think our policy around the use of them is very clear. It did cause some issues because if somebody was reporting an incident of harassment, some officers may have taken the view of issuing a harassment warning to the perpetrator at that time to use it as evidence in the future to demonstrate a course of conduct. Because if you've had a warning and then you go to do it and you do it again, actually that's really clear in terms of actually, when we looked at stalking harassment and we did a review of the incidents through the Nexus team, it was clear that some officers were going to use harassment warnings, either A, based around what the victim had asked for, they just want the person warning as opposed to prosecution, or also that seemed to be the appropriate remedy at the time. But when we looked at some of the details, there was quite clearly a course of conduct that was being described by the victim already, and so it should be investigated further. The direction that we set when at the end of that is any report should be fully investigated. So if somebody's reporting harassment, we should fully investigate that. We should look for CCTV if that's appropriate, get other witness statements, look at offences such as malicious communication, interview the perpetrator, look at the relationship between perpetrator, have they had harassment warnings before, perhaps another partner, and they're doing the same, and then look at it in its entirety and only issue a harassment warning if nothing else can be done. So every avenue has been explored, it has failed, that's the last resort, as opposed to what may have been previously a first resort. And when I talk about the first resort in North Yorkshire, I think that's reflective nationally. That's not just an issue within North Yorkshire, that's happening countrywide. In terms of my personal view where harassment warnings sit, I think if somebody makes a report to the police of harassment, it needs to be investigated fully, and that would include interviewing a suspect. And if that includes interviewing the suspect then knows in the future that what they're doing is causing that person harassment, so you wouldn't need a harassment warning. Does that answer your question?
It does. Assuming then, given the change in approach from a point in time last year, I assume, could you send us the number of HINs that have been issued? Because I'm assuming that will have been cut drastically, given it's now a last resort rather than a first resort.
Yes, and we're, as a result of the meeting last week, which was represented by the National Stalking Harassment Working Group, our force policy is now going to be reviewed in relation to that. So actually, can there be much clearer direction around the use of HINs?
So it can be reviewed again.
It's going to be reviewed because we need to do that on the back of that national direction.
I think the issue we've got is that we're waiting for clarity nationally in terms of what you've got. And HMIC saying stop using pins immediately. National Lead saying don't do that. We're in a position then, so if we take pins away and actually advice is you can use them, i.e. as a last resort, we've then got to try and reintroduce them again. And so actually what we're saying is that we need the national clarity of where we're going. It's absolutely right. I think we need to review how we've been using them and whether we've been using them inappropriately at times, which we have. So actually we need to readdress that element. Get the national clarity. If national stance is then remove pins, we're in a position where we can do that anyway. If we remove pins, my concern is that National League and College of Police, etc. say, no, they're appropriate, carry on using them, then we're then having to reintroduce them and retrain people. So I think we just need to make sure we're doing something once as opposed to twice.
And just to get my understanding straight, HMIC said don't use them. Did that lead to a review internally here about how they were used?
It led to us contacting the National League for stalking and harassment, and the advice from the MPCC National League was you can still use it. So we're waiting for that clarity to come through as to what is the position, definitive position that we can move to.
So Alan, going through the process of last resort rather than first resort potentially, has that been implemented yet?
That was probably over a year ago.
Okay. So what happened last week to make you review that again, given you seemed pretty comfortable 5 minutes ago that the last resort seemed an appropriate way to use HINs? It sounds like you're now reviewing it again.
That's in relation to the meeting that we were at, the national meeting through the Stalking Harassment Working Group.
What did that change?
That's had some input around what CPS's directions are around investigation, stalking and harassment, and considerations towards those investigations.
Can you tell me in layman's terms what that might change in your process? So, because it sounds like at the moment you're using it in the least possible number of occasions. Yes. I don't know how you can review it and go any further without not using them anymore, or about using them more.
Okay. No, I'm not dodging.
No, I know. I'm just
okay. The meeting was on Friday.
Yeah.
I've not had a full update in relation to that meeting and the information that was disclosed. Okay, but I'm aware of some of the headlines from that, and as a result of that, I think it's right that we do review it so that we can make an informed decision. Because I don't have the full details as to what was said in the meeting, I think it would be wrong of me to say here, that's what we're going to do, these are the reasons why, because it's not the full context of it.
No, okay, understood.
And I don't want to either A, give you the wrong information, more importantly the public,
Yeah.
or Mr. Kane or the chief.
No, understood. If
I think
it's
what
aware
we're
of what we
trying
need to look at.
what we're trying to do is ensure that we're aligned to the national working group and the recommendations coming out of that, because they're engaged with CPS and others. So actually, it's the recommendations coming out from that group and the national lead on stalking and harassment that I think is where we're trying to make sure that we are connected to that and reacting to that, as opposed to reacting to the HMIC report in isolation.
No, and I fully understand that. I'm just trying to get straight in my head. There aren't many places to go from the current position in North Yorkshire.
No, but it could be that CPS have reviewed their stance on how they utilise the evidence that's captured, whether that's pins, whether that's digital evidence, whatever that might be, and that's the review that we need to take place, is how are we progressing against what's coming out from that group.
Well,
And I think the flexibility for us to react to that national working group is what we're trying to keep.
understood. So, Tom, I'll come to you in a second. Evie, if you can make an action to get an update on the HIN process at North Yorkshire Police once you've done that review, however, whether that's just thinking about it more or something's
Yeah.
written down, but if you could share it with us once you've
Yeah.
The numbers.
And the numbers as well, please, yeah.
And that will be one of the items that we'll discuss within the stalking harassment workshop, because actually it needs to have a number of parts to it, not just a single review.
If you'd want, not for this meeting, we'll talk about it afterwards, but at the CGL Untitled Trust conference was the father of Alice Ruggles, who now, I don't know if he chairs it, but manages the Alice Ruggles Trust. She was a victim of stalking homicide in Northumbria, but it was a really powerful presentation, and also lots of evidence from that. So the first call Alice made to Northumbria Police was dealt with terribly, but it got just a really interesting story to tell, and if that normally focuses on schools, but he found it really interesting to come to the CGL Untitled Trust conference to speak to service providers and users, and I'm sure he'd be, well, I'm not sure, I would certainly ask him to come to North Yorkshire if that would be of all of interest, but whether the workshop's the right forum, but we can think about some of those other ways to get training.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just clarify? So, I'm not going to drill, but is your understanding from the review that you're going to be able to do that you've gone too far and you might need to come back to using more of them?
No, I think
The review's not just based around, I think the problem is, we'll probably had the conversation halfway talking about pins. The review is about our approach to stalking and harassment, and not just from the national working group, not just about pins.
Okay.
I see.
There we go.
thank you.
Does that include things like stalking clinics and that kind of stuff? Does it go that far? Does that type of approach get talked about at that group?
At the workshop,
No, at your national working group. So the best practice that is going on in the Cheshires and Hampshires of the world, does that get discussed at those groups for people like you to come back and go, right, okay, how do we want to do that in North Yorkshire? If so, how would it work? Who's going to do it?
okay. I can't answer that, and the reason for that is the national group for stalking harassment has only recently been created. The first meeting was last week, and I think that probably is reflective of the importance that all police forces across the country are putting into this nationally. And in terms of the regional representation, that's myself, but because I was off last week, which I explained, I wasn't there. So in terms of the finer details of that, whether or not that was discussed, I can't answer that yet.
Sure. Okay. If you want, so Hannah and I have been speaking to Hampshires and Cheshires of the world to understand as fully as possible their process around some of this stuff, given they seem to be the market leaders and how their stalking clinics work and who goes and all that stuff. We've got a pretty good understanding now. It might be you and your office have the same thing, and that is crystallised in the group. You weren't able to attend, but if you need anything from us,
And again, I'll be really surprised if they weren't represented on that group as well.
of course,
So.
absolutely, yeah. And their part of their funding is to understand exactly the improvements they've made and be able to share them and what's worth.
And that should go through the College of Police and what works as well.
I'm sure they're involved. Yeah.
Sorry, final point of clarification. From what you've said, I understand that a year or more ago there was a direction given out that pins should only be used as a last resort.
Should be in North Yorkshire.
In North Yorkshire Police. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Is there any timeframes around that APP, by the way?
We've been chasing that
I know.
for a while. Who was it? I can't remember. Was it Karen? Chasing out? I can't remember who it was. Now I was chasing out.
Joe Bilby has
Joe.
been.
I know it's not
Has
just
been.
North Yorkshire Police. Everybody's waiting for
Everybody.
Yeah, it's
for
national.
but there's no college haven't said, all right, give us till August or something. There's no understanding of a time frame around.
No, and the national lead for stalking harassment has changed as well. So, not that that should be a negative. Actually, there's a new person who's responsible for it, so that might give some direction, some timescales attached to that.
Can't slow things down at the same time, though, can't it?
Okay. And just in that national state, I've touched on that national working group, which is obviously, I think, the important way to move forward. So, in terms
on the national working group, just out of interest, do you know, are the victim support side of things represented there, or is it a police meeting? You weren't there, you don't know. I've just remembered. It's just out of interest because there are very few specialist stalking support services out there, but so there might be a similar side to whilst police might need to investigate in a certain way and have processes, there is the other end of the victim support side that, again, best practice needs to be shared and understood.
if it's reflective of one of the other national groups that I sit on around, which is for rape, victims are represented.
Right.
Okay, and equally CPS and those agencies that would be involved within the investigation and the victim support would be. So that's based on the other groups that were well.
Could you send me as an action though people who go to it, just out of interest?
Yeah, I can get that list for you.
Thank you.
Victims view.
Sorry, I sent an email just chasing when the guidance was expected, and apparently it's due.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the answer we've been getting for about a year.
No more specific than that, just due.
No, we've been getting that for about a year,
Right.
so no change.
We won't hold our breath.
Yeah.
Sounds like other key announcements were expected.
Yes, let's
Okay. In terms of victims' views, there are times when victims have been given advice on changing their way of life, what their behaviour is in some way. I think that can be negative because they're the victim. Why should they change as a result of somebody else's behaviours? And that is something that we need to make sure we can provide them more support with. And actually, they should be able to do what they need to go about their normal life. They are the victim. They've done nothing wrong. Why should they change? And that's something that they raise as a concern for us today.
totally agree with you. I suppose what that's kind of getting at, I don't think it's the point of the slide, is the risk. And again at the Strategic Land Conference, Vera Baird gave a presentation at the beginning, and part of her view was that individuals will have different resilience levels, for example, and they will call the police at different times and explain things in different ways, and may have taken steps to change their behaviour because they're happy and willing to do that, and others may not be. Does the dash and the subsequent forms understand that resilience and the way that individual is dealing with it in a sort of nuanced way to sort of get to the bottom of the actual risk, rather than just I'm actually just happen to be very resilient in dealing with it, and I don't really understand the risk is this high? Does that come out in the various sort of ways that the offence is understood?
Within the domestic abuse assault and harassment form, the 253, the questions are based on how the victim feels.
That's the point. So they may well say, I'm not that worried about it, but you might go, well, subsequently I'm really worried about it because A, they've done it before, but all these reasons.
And that's where there needs to be that investigation. Okay, so instead of just we'll go and give the person a warning, actually let's have a look at the perpetrator. What is the risk that that perpetrator presents to the victim, other people, and deal with that? Because otherwise you could just go with the person of particular concern. What is the risk that individual presents? Because unless we know the motive and who that person is, we don't understand the risk, and that's what we need to do. So it's it's a risk assessment. It's not a definitive guide, but there should be that supporting investigation around the offence that's been disclosed, so that an informed risk assessment can be made around that perpetrator, and that's the way it's got to be done. Yeah,
which is great. So one of the benefits as in stand-up stalking clinic is because they have, for example, clinical psychologists around the table, they have a really in-depth understanding of risk, which isn't just about necessarily will the actions and behaviours of an offender escalate to the point where it might become physical. It is also that repeated low-level, non-threatening stalking that might lead to self-harm and other psychological problems for the victim that are just as harmful potentially, if not more so, but aren't understood in the threatening element of risk. which I think you can probably only get from that wider multi-agency perspective, because I think it is sort of hard to recognise a lot of the time. And is one of the impressive bits of those clinics is having those people around the table that can give that insight.
I think it's with all approaches of problem solving. It's having the right people around the table with the right information, so that they can put their professional judgment in relation to either the victim, the perpetrator, and what plans can be put in place.
Yeah, and in terms of prevention, as I understand it, I won't talk about a case that ended in homicide that Cheshire feel like, on the face of what they know about the offence, if it happened in Cheshire and had gone to the clinic, the offender had told their GP something a week or so before the homicide that would have been reported in the clinic, should timings have been right and all those things, that would have ended up in actions being taken by partners. So, that sharing of information, as always, the classic police problem and health problem. So there are ways to go about preventing some of these things by having that information shared between partners, which is a challenge, I know.
We've looked at, in terms of the sort of work that we've done, we've looked at 2 case studies in terms of the differences between the way that they've been dealt with. I think if we looked at the 2, one, we would classify the perpetrator as the incompetent suitor.
Does an offender always get a classification, as it were?
Not always. It's just in terms of where the association between the victim, the offender, and that's where they fit in within that group, because they're the general of the 5.
Sure.
Okay. In terms of the incompetent suitor case, that is a case where, when the victim contacted the North Yorkshire Police, her views were listened to. They were understood by the officers who attended, and those officers quickly identified offences that had been committed. They investigated those that led to the arrest of the perpetrator in relation to the offences that were committed. Because of the dynamics of the victim with young children, there were lots of different agencies involved, children's social care, some health, and so it was agreed that a multi-agency meeting will be pulled together.
Was that a MARAC or a MAPA? Not what, well, generally speaking, which do you hold?
For stalking harassment cases, neither. Okay. And it was felt that a multi-agency meeting was needed, but nobody knew how to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so they approached myself in relation to that, to say, well, how can we do that? And we actually said, go down the MARAC route. The similarity, it's not stalking harassment, we're having a MARAC meeting. Just follow a similar process, invite those people, share all the information, discuss the concerns, and on the back of that multi-agency meeting, they were able to put in some really good safeguarding for the family, and also to have a safety plan, so that even the local authority were there who had to say, we're able to put some more fences up and put some housing, lighting at the back of your property to reduce the impact, also the opportunities for the perpetrator, which I think was really beneficial to have housing there within that group. The safety plan stopped further incidents taking place because of the concerns and the risk that the perpetrator presented, charged, remanded and was convicted, and a restraining order was obtained on conviction, which I think was really important to remember, to ask for that whilst we're going through the process, and the occurrence ceased. So in that respect, for that investigation, it was quickly identified for those officers who were responding to it. I think...
Do you go about learning the lessons of how it was identified? So that might have been a really easy case where a victim said, I'm being stalked, but it might have been one where they were disclosing other things, and stalking was proactively sort of understood by the officer. But why? Did they have training? I don't know, but do you go into that detail to know why did we deal with that so well?
I think it was because when the officers went with the services, they understood what the issues were straight away, very quickly, in terms of the perpetrator and his perhaps intentions towards the victim. And that is, when it's clear cut, it's perhaps easy to understand.
Yeah.
in contrast to, because what they were describing was a criminal offence from the start. Whereas when you look at the rejected case study, the initial reports indicated that perhaps it wasn't criminal. When you get further reports of to the police, they weren't deemed to be of a criminal nature. It was more of ASB, so they weren't being picked upon. And they were the challenges because it isn't readily identified as being stalking and harassment because of the nature of the reports that were coming from the victim. And that's around knowledge, not just looking at an incident in isolation, looking at it across the spectrum of all those reports by the victim and the association to the perpetrator and what's being said. It was quite clear when that's been looked at there wasn't any coordination between those occurrences that have been reported, and that's why I think that's important to have now. The perpetrator was interviewed, but we've still had further breaches being reported because it needs to have that grip around it, which links into some of the actions that we've put into place.
So that multi-agent safeguarding seems like an informal clinic, I guess. I don't know who was around the table, but it was a sort of start of a turn on what Hampshire and Cheshire would call a clinic, basically, where you share all that information, get everybody's input into what do you know about the victim, what do you know about the offender, what do we do next?
Yeah, it's just having all those people who've got any information around the table, so that can be discussed.
The big for there is that, you know, if you've got children, you might have education, you might have schools around the table, etc. Like that. It's just about putting the right safeguarding plan around the victim and the family, and then the investigators taking that forward through the investigation. It's a coordinated approach, isn't it? I think. Whereas the second one, we haven't taken that same opportunity, and that's led to a lesser service for that victim.
So, looking at those two case studies, because I think they're really good examples of what's worked, what hasn't worked, and taking a learning from both of those. Where we are with the local and the national state in relation to stalking and harassment, we've had a number of actions that we're putting into place. So, stalking and harassment is one of the North Yorkshire Police's force tactical priorities. That's looked at our task and coordinating meeting, which is chaired every 6 weeks by one of the assistant chief constables. And that looks at progress that has been made in relation to our plan. So the performance indicators that we've got set within that plan, which are around the number of incidents that have been reported, the number of arrests, the number of interviews of perpetrators. We include the number of PINs that are being issued, compliance rates for the completion of the 253 stalking harassment forms, because people need to understand that, and that shows if those numbers increase around the recording of the 253, people are recognising the offences.
Yeah.
That's the direction that should be going.
Ditto on the article in S-dash, you said there were some questions that stem from if you sort of tick the stalking box in a dash,
Yes.
you then it's how many of those are filled in as well. Cause
And that's it, it's very specific, it's around the stalking harassment question set, not just the four.
Thank you.
Okay. Also looking at the number of flags for victims, perpetrators, and the number of plans that we've got in place too. I've mentioned to you about reviewing force policy and the guidance. I think that's been really important that we've done that. Mr. Keynes mentioned that we had a review by the Nexus team in relation to stalking and harassment, which was very informative, and that led to some of the guidance and a flow chart about hidden direction when they should be issued in those rare occasions as a last resort.
Just on it might be something you can, it's not immediately obvious to me, hence my question. On who's investigating or who's in charge of an investigation of stalking? Will that always be someone in an investigation level? Might that be in neighbourhoods or?
I think it would depend on what is the nature of it. Okay, for example, if it was a stranger stalking, which is probably the most serious of the stalking offences that we would deal with, because we don't know the true risk that's presented. My expectation that would be one of the PIP2, a detective, who would be in charge of that investigation to exploit all the investigative opportunities. If we look at some of the other end of the spectrum around some of the harassment offences, that might be dealt with by the neighbourhood policing team.
It's stalking now?
Just stalking. So if it's in relation to stalking, I would expect it to be or the investigators, the investigative team. We've also, within the neighbourhood policing conferences, given input on stalking harassment by the force leader, the plan owner at the time. And we've also developed an aid memoir, which has been allocated and given to all the officers across the force. That's got basically a guide, toolkit for officers when they go out to deal with incidents of stalking harassment, which is looking at people, the protection, the performance, what their powers are, when they should use pins as the last resort, and the protocols that they can follow as well. So that's been issued to all officers, so they've got that guidance, so they know what they need to deal with when they go out. We've also looked at...
In and of itself, obviously, no arguments about that. How many aid memoirs are given to officers? So stalking harassment is something that they get one about. I know poaching, for example, is in every car. Is there a question about being drowned out, the stalking harassment priority being drowned out by the other priorities that we have on modern slavery and all those other things?
I think that's one of the real challenges of all the messages that we've got to give of. We've got domestic abuse, we've got stalking harassment, you allude to rural crime, modern slavery, human trafficking. Which one is the priority? Actually, we've got our force control strategy. That sets out what our tactical priorities are, and that's what officers should be working towards. And the aid memoirs there is just as an assistance guide.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at, and I know it's very hard. I don't suggest we do measure it, but understanding how well this lands with those people you really want it to, and there'll be some you want it to more. So control room who are taking reports where you want them to pull out stalking as quickly as they can. Some response cops in certain areas, there are pockets of cops that you'd really like to know are as well trained and aware as possible, and some you're less bothered about that an aid memoir might well be enough for the occasion where they whip it out and sort of go through it. But it's sort of targeting of it, I suppose, and how well it lands.
If it's truly an aid memoir, so it's a nudge, it needs to be most effective, it needs to be situational, doesn't it? So we go back to the EV discussion this morning about old world measures for new world activities. One of the things that you'd hope would come out of greater mobile technology would be everything is sitting behind it in terms of a potential prompt, but it doesn't prompt until you make your first move. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then you get a policy prompt or a prior, because otherwise you've just got too much to remember, haven't you? So if you've got to remember everything, there's no memoir being aided at all. So I think one of the things that we should be certainly talking to the ISG team about is how versatile you then make that says actually you start from a kind of blank screen, and then once you've made your first inquiry or input, there are a series of prompts that come up because it's done the thinking for you. I think that would be one of the real advantages. Plus we'd know that you got it because we'd be able to record the fact that you had a prompt, wouldn't we? Then we'd be able to answer that.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet.
No. And I know that this is one of many things that requires training of some kind, and I fully appreciate that as a task in and of itself in North Yorkshire, given the geography and all those things. So I do appreciate that. It does seem to me though that in-depth training of one kind or another and targeted has seemed to made a big difference in the forces where they've done it. So Sussex, where they went from 45 offences to 1,000, was largely, they think, as a result of training, i.e. awareness, and pulling those things out early and everything else following after that. And whilst there's things in there about online training and force-wide briefings and aid memoirs, I just wonder if there is some specific training for specific individuals that might need to be just considered really carefully. Not that that's easy.
It's not, because this is something that Niles Costello, before Alan took over, was looking at again, was waiting for the
Some
guidance
national
from the
training.
College of Policing, because what do you build your training package against? If the APP comes out and you've got to retrain all over again then.
No.
So this it's coming out.
There's a chicken and eggs
We've been waiting to design a training package.
I totally appreciate that, and I'm not saying that Hampshire and Cheshire do it right, because they'll do something right, something wrong, but they have taken the decision to can't wait.
Which is what we did with the online training.
And
We took that to say,
but
we've got to give them something.
So totally, and they take it further and sent officers and staff and others on this SRP training, which is in Canterbury in a few weeks' time, if any officers do want to go on it. And for example, the Sussex training is delivered to CPS and magistrates and other people. So it's, you know, there is, just because there is no national guidance doesn't mean you can't get on with some stuff.
No, absolutely, and we haven't been waiting.
No, I know.
We've been doing some things, maybe not to the level that
Yeah.
we're talking about, but we do need the support from the College of Police.
So, and the training that has been given, we're talking about online packages which are recognised by the College of Police around stalking harassment. We monitor the completion rates for that. We also
Are
Are
they good, those completion rates?
in terms of stalking harassment, the last set that I saw were. So, and that's across not just response officers who go out, it also includes people who set the control rooms, because there's different groups of people for that. One of the things we're really keen about is identifying learning from other cases.
Yeah.
So one of our forces that we do work with had a significant incident around stalking harassment, and there was some learning from that incident. We took an opportunity to video one of their presentations. We deliver that to the inspectors' training days of, you need to understand what stalking harassment is about. And that's a quite a chilling incident, but actually we put a load of that onto our system, and the number of officers that have seen that across the county is positive. And there's a lot of learning that's come from that about actually, don't just dismiss a one-off incident or what you might think is not meaningful, because what the victim's saying is very important. And there was a lot to learnings from that. We've had positive feedback from that. I think one of the important areas that we need to do, and we have done, is raise public awareness. So, you know, I'm thankful for today to be able to do that, because it shows it's important to us. But we've also supported that through the No Home Here campaign in terms of stalking harassment, and that's led for some further media interest around those specific areas, which is really important. I've already alluded to the National Stalking Harassment Working Group, and for some of the cases which I've become aware of, where perhaps the progress hasn't been made, which I would have expected and liked, we've suggested having conferences, multi-agency conferences around the high-risk victim to make sure there is a better plan, and that those victims get the support and service from North Yorkshire Police and partners to make sure that they're safe, which is what we've done. And as you know, we've met with some of the victims and had conversations with them and listened so that they can air their concerns to us, and I think that's really important that we can do that from at our level.
I plan to continue to do if I can. So the only other action I got going back to the pin conversation, I think we got slightly confused whether we thought you were just talking about pins for a minute. So the numbers of pins and if you do come to a decision on that in time, because I'd like to know what it is, but in the meantime to share the review you do on stalking harassment in the round and what that changes and what you're hoping to achieve with that would be really helpful for when you get there. And the workshop forms part of that.
Okay, so just for clarity, in terms of the review, it's the review of the force policy, as opposed to reviewing stalking harassment.
No, sorry, for that. I
The workshop would be around actually how we're responding, what can we do to improve it. So that would probably result in an action plan around how we deliver.
So it might be worthwhile, I'll suggest inviting Cheshire or Sussex to your workshop, if they can come along. That might be useful.
Or Hampshire, yeah.
In terms of that, we're going to visit Cheshire before the workshop, so we get the understanding of how it all works.
I organised a visit, and Hampshire offered as well, but that's further to go, so we decided Cheshire was the right one. And they've had a lot of interest after their spot on the conference, so there's 3 or 4 forces going at the same time, because they got 4 requests and said we're not doing it full time, you can come on this date if you want to come. So with the OPCC and some of the Ireland team are going to come. Will that policy include review's not the right word, I know that, but a decision on whether any training, and if any, and to who is needed, and things like stalking clinics, which
we will need training. It's what that training looks like,
of course, and who it goes to. But so that will be clear in the when you finish that review.
And I think that will fall out of the workshop. 2 different pieces of work. One's a review of force policy, where we sit with pins or harassment law. The other is a workshop on stalking harassment and how we can develop and move forward.
Okay. Which we're part of, which is great.
Yes.
Because I've got lots of ideas. Thank you, Alan. Do you want to go through those just for anyone who is a victim who is
The next
watching?
slide at the end is around questions, because I'm conscious that we may have some questions from in the room or from members of the public if they've emailed in whilst we've been speaking. Although it was important that we list the specialist support that is available. So in addition to supporting victims that we have locally, actually there are 3 national support agencies that support victims, which is important.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for your orientation. And I appreciate this is a forced priority and it's being taken seriously. That doesn't stop me thinking there's lots that can be done to improve things, and I think there are some forces who are sort of leading lights in that respect that we could probably learn a lot from. How that translates in North, which is always a challenge with the geography and other things, but there's lots out there that I think are worthy of close consideration and to help force and victims most importantly. But thank you very much for that effort that's gone into that. That's very helpful. Phil, on the next, unless anyone else has got any questions, sorry, I know we don't need a slide that offers us that opportunity, as Alan Wells knows, but has anyone got any questions to finish? Okay. On the next item, Phil, we're 50 minutes over, but that's partly because I knew the update on COVID would be relatively speedy.
Yeah.
So if you could do that with speed in mind, and then we'll almost have caught up for items 6 and 7.
Okay, right, no problem. So essentially, where we are with hydraulic fracturing is we're in terms of the operation on the ground, the COVID Misperton, it's in a pause state. And we've undertaken a review of that operation internally to have a look at what lessons can be learned for applying going forward. We anticipate the operation on the ground will probably pick up again in late autumn. At the moment, we're in the process of going through the court cases from those that have been charged. So in terms of costs, you can see as a result of that pause, the costs have virtually come to zero. It's just over £2,000 for individuals keeping that engagement with the operation to make sure that's being prepared, ready going forward. So that's where we are in terms of the cost for that. And again, total arrest from the first operation amounts to 86. As I said, they are now working their way, those that have been charged are now working their way through the criminal justice process.
Could my one request be as an action for the next meeting? And I don't think the next meeting is the wash-up. I think the July meeting is going to be the one where we go through that wider lessons learned piece. But on court outcomes, assuming there are some, there may not be, but I think there are some not guilty verdicts as well. To have all of them, it looks a bit sort of rose-tinted glasses at the moment that we've only got the guilty ones on there.
Yeah, sure.
And it just helps sort of understand again an element of what's happened.
Okay. So essentially, that's a real brief counter through to where we are with.
If the public have any questions, as always they can ask. Yeah, as part of this or separately. But the only thing you may not know, Phil, I know Amanda leads on this in particular. The application to the Home Office /HMIC to come and inspect your books, is that work still progressing with the finance team to get all that ship shape?
I don't know, I'm afraid, in terms of that. I don't know that detail now.
That's fine. So that's item 5 completed. So 6 and 7 are now taken together, Phil, and we have half an hour.
Okay. So in terms of the people plan, we're at again working towards officer numbers of 1,400 in the force. So on the 5th of March this year, we had 28 students commence their training. Next intake of 28 students is planned for July. That intake in July is our most successful in terms of recruitment from protected characteristics.
Has that been through every process, including vetting, or are we still at vetting stage for the July intake?
I don't know personally in terms of where we're at. My
vetting and protected characteristics often are in conflict.
Yeah, I don't know where they are in terms of that process as individuals, but they are planned to come in on July. Obviously, Ramadan's running at the moment, so again we're planning for making sure we've got that July intake lined up. The other elements we're doing around that as well to support around positive action is to additionally train our tutor constables in relation to understanding the variances from different protected characteristics, look at how we can support them through their training, what additional support they might need going through, and making sure that supervisors and assessors take that into account as well.
That's great. Could I, an action, either as an action update or maybe as just one additional slide as a one-off in this particular bit of the performance pack, to have something on that diversity update, so what does success look like, how many protected characteristics were successful in that intake, and a little bit more about that positive action, just because it is really important. Whether that slide stays, I don't mind so much, but if it just could be an update on that for the next time, that would be quite helpful, I think.
Okay.
That slide already exists from the people board,
Yeah.
so it can just go straight
Yeah,
after.
fantastic.
Okay. And then PCSOs.
Just on
Sorry,
Phil,
go
on the for the public's point of view, we've got 28 in March, 28 in July. Is that the quickest police can actively recruit, given the impact it has on having to tutor those people? The effort that goes in HR to get them in, all the assessment process, all those things, and then they start.
Yes.
They all need tutoring at a pretty intensive level to start with.
Yeah. So
Is
again,
that as quickly as North Yorkshire Police can recruit people?
It's taking into account the size of our classrooms. It's taking into account the number of trainers we've got for the classroom work. There's also, again, for the intake in July, we're having to recruit and train up tutor constables when they come out on the ground for the 10-week tutoring phase as well. So that's, for me, if you start to increase it much more than that, you're then starting to talk about tutor units, and that's starting to lessen the impact of that positive action work that we were doing around tutors.
That's great, and it's reassurance to the public really that we're working as quickly as we can to get officers out on the street, is what I sort of meant to say.
Absolutely, yeah. To get us up to that 1400, the work's going as quickly as we can. So I think this slide essentially just gives you the breakdown of staff numbers there, and again, we're currently undertaking some work in relation to what vacancy factors look like for our police staff area of business.
Yep.
So the last one, this one shows our volunteers. I think in terms of that, currently have 266 volunteers in North Yorkshire Police. I think that's the largest public sector volunteer group in North Yorkshire. And again, working with our partners as well, and the partnership that we're looking at how we can best use those volunteers in a way that actually we can link across with other public sector agencies, how we can use them going forward with our neighbourhood policing teams, etc. So actually we're looking to how we can expand that as well. Not rest on our laurels that we've got the largest volunteer sector across North Yorkshire.
And I won't add it as an action, but I might catch up with the relevant person about specials, because I know the police did an awful lot of work on specials for a couple of years, and it wasn't we talked about a lot, and I feel like we haven't necessarily had that discussion or conversation for a while. On recruitment was difficult, and we were trying to get rural PCSO specials, for example, and making sure they were meeting the needs of the police as well as the volunteers. But
and the challenge with us with the special constables is always, when we're recruiting police officers, they're ideal candidates to become the next regular constables. So
constant turnover.
So
the reason I asked is because the 142 looks extremely steady for what is a workforce with a bit of churn, because they often are successful in applications.
Yeah. So I suppose moving on to performance area business. So again, this is slightly different to how it's been presented before. So looking at this is our proactive policing contingent within North Yorkshire Police, and it just shows activity where they're focused on some of our force priorities. So if we look at the bar charts that go across, you can see a lot of activity focused on the county lines that someone's taken. So again,
how's that distinct from drug production and supply?
So it's the methodology of individuals that are
what they're attacked.
It's the methodology applied by the criminals into how they come in. So county lines refers to the telephone lines that are being adopted from larger metropolitan cities. So they're organised crime groups sending individuals into forces such as ourselves to deal drugs in locations such as Scarborough, York, Harrogate, wherever that might be, and controlling, so essentially go into a vulnerable premise, controlling that premise and selling drugs from that area. So it's a specific methodology, county lines.
Sure. So the bar chart attached to drug production and supply is all the stuff that is not under the county line umbrella.
There could be a little bit of crossover depending on when we've. So if we've taken a vehicle out, for example on the A64, we've got a quantity of drugs back that could have been linked to a county lines supply, but we've taken it out on earlier stage. So there could be a little bit of crossover, but I think it just shows the focus that we've got in relation to that crime type is certainly having a detrimental impact, certainly in areas like Scarborough and Harrogate in particular, seen a rise in that type of criminology.
Thank you, Phil. And I don't know if you can explain it. I can't understand it. The box.
So it's essentially they're just trying to show us the impact of the different. So you've got Roads Policing Group, our operational support units, and our firearms support unit. Yeah. So for us, it's just about the red and the blue are about which part of the control strategy they're impacted on. So the red elements for operational support units are for reducing victim harm, and then you've got firearms units around the community harm. So it's just showing the area of the control strategy as a whole. That little box is probably not helpful for you, to be honest. It's the larger bars.
Which I understand.
Yeah.
The bit I don't understand is the box. It might be.
I think the colouring is not quite right in the box. I think.
It certainly doesn't make sense. It might just. I know Mark is throwing loads of effort into this.
Yeah,
it might be worth until something's clear. Just keep
take
it
the little
out.
box out. Yeah.
Because the rest makes sense. But one question. I asked this before. There are 4 at the top that have got 0 action, which makes sense. I wouldn't necessarily expect proactive policing to deal with fraud.
Yeah.
You might, though, slightly expect some organised immigration crime to be responded to. Is there any reason? Well, you won't necessarily know the answer, but
so again, it depends on what operations have run within that month. So it might be that working with immigration services, border agencies, those operations haven't run.
Next month it might go to
it might
1,000 and then back to
depends
0.
on, Yes, it depends on what we're looking at.
It's
again,
less sort of reactive in that sense.
It is, and just to reassure the public, this is just a proportion of our resource, the proactive policing resource. So you will have investigators. We've got a dedicated fraud team. We've got all the teams looking at domestic abuse. We've got modern slavery problem-solving plans. So there's other work ongoing that isn't shown on this chart.
Well explained,
Just in terms of this one, this is the force control room, and essentially we've had the highest volumes of calls presented in any April since 2011, but we've still had a significant reduction in our time to answer. So I think
which is good to see.
what we've seen since the instigation of the goal group for the force control, we've seen sustained increases in performance. So reductions in call answering times, reduction in abandonment rates, and transference to secondary 999 lines, which would. So where we were in the position where we were flagged as one of the forces that had too many 999s not answered within the 2 minute range, we haven't been on that for a while now. So the impacts of the goal group and the changes, the recruitment of staff, the changes to taking out the crime recording occurrence management unit and making that a separate function, bringing in the Q-Buster, the new introduction of the wall board has seen a significant improvement in the force control room. So the next phase of that now is we're currently building an extension to the control room, which is they say it's a temporary, but it looks like a permanent building to me in terms of how it's done. So we will then have the ability then to have a full-time tutor unit for staff in the control room, and we'll have the ability to separate our dispatch function from our call handlers, so we can really focus in on getting those 101s and 999s answered even faster than we are now.
And I presume I'm right in saying the increased demand for 999 somewhat limits the response time for 101. That's not to say it can't improve as well, but as 999s will rightly be prioritised. If that was to stay stable, it would give call handlers more time to the ability to answer 101 calls quicker. But while 999 continues to go up, it just stops them being as able to respond to 101s.
It is a challenge, but even I think we've got, the target of us answering the 101s in under 1 minute is a challenge for us at the moment. We are achieving it at times. The element for us though is that we are hitting our 999 targets on a routine basis. So we're getting to the emergency calls. I think the elements now, the next phase, and the introduction of the additional staff that are being trained at the moment and the tutor unit will allow us then to start to look at bringing that 101 call time down to below a minute.
And I know we just talked about officer recruitment. I know there's constant intake effectively in the control room, but there was a big intake in February that has just sort of been able to work independently about now.
That's right.
So that should make a difference.
Yeah, and we did have a blip in March for performance in there, but that was a national blip, it wasn't just a North Yorkshire blip.
It's the snow blip,
So
wasn't
it was severely impacted by the weather. Yeah.
I think the important thing for us on this now, that it appears to have seen the improvements, is consistency. Because there's a real risk, isn't there, that people say, turn the tap off, everything's okay now, when actually we know our busiest period is over the summer.
Yep.
Yeah.
And actually we need to see consistent performance on a daily basis, and you're right, we see the 999 performance consistent, but the 101 performance absolutely still requires that consistent improvement.
And if you look at call waiting times over a quarterly, i.e. seasonal period, you'd see the summer spike and then it's back down. And
Yeah.
it just does that. But
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're really conscious of that, and I think this is why the work on the improvements to the force control room, we're hoping again should be the temporary building should be handed over for the 8th of June for us. So but the focus of that working group is absolutely the performance to the public is a priority in relation to whilst we're doing that.
Yeah.
So this is the 101 call times again. So again, we've just discussed that one, but there's been a significant improvement in abandoned calls through 101s. That's down from 714 in March this year. So so whilst it's going in the right direction, it needs to be sustainable, I think, is what we've got to look at and see how that goes. So the Q Buster. So again, we've had over 2,000 callbacks within the Q Buster that went to an engaged line. So at the moment, it's probably averaging just over 12 minutes for a callback. What's not helping us there, I suppose, is that when we have made 2,000 of those callbacks, they've gone to engaged line, which means we have to really do that again.
And
So-
do we? It might be part of Kate Williams' work on customer service. Do we have any understanding of whether 12 minutes feels acceptable to our
Well, we've looked at that from similar forces that have a similar system in place, and their demand levels, and it's about a similar sort of level to what others are experiencing. Around about 12 minutes feels about what the average is.
And I don't dispute that's the average of
Mm.
the forces that have that facility, but how does that feel to the people getting the call back? Does 12 minutes feel about right? So when I did it, I got told off because they said I should have stayed on the phone to report something because it was a live type incident. But it sort of strikes me that 12 minutes might feel like 2 minutes. If you go and make a cup of tea and do other things and you can call back, it doesn't feel like very long, but
Yeah.
it's not clear if it feels about right for the public, that's all. I don't deny it's average times compared to others, it's just how does it feel when you're on the receiving end of 12 minutes.
Yeah.
But I'll speak to Kate about it because it's a customer service thing as much as
Okay. So moving on to what we're looking at in terms of the types of calls for service that we're dealing with. So we'll go through different commands in relation to this, but just to give you an idea really. So the PSW is public safety and welfare calls for service. So that's not crime, that's not antisocial behaviour, and that's not road related incidents. They are things like your mental health incidents, your missing from homes, those type of areas. So it would be potentially some of your what would be stalking and harassment incidents, not crimes. Some of your malicious communications that maybe don't fall into a crime area, would fall into an occurrence area. They sit into the public safety and welfare. So you can see the level of demand there around that. So
So is the red bar then things that have been crimed at source effectively? That are
no, they are crime incidents that we attend. So it could be crimed at source, or it could be crimed when an officer's gone to that. So a response officer's gone to it and it's a crime, so they've dealt with it.
Okay.
So it's the volume of crime versus the volume of public safety and welfare incidents.
So just thinking about stalking and harassment then, if that gets recorded as a crime at some point, it'll end up in the red box, right?
Be in the red bar.
Yeah.
So if you look at the volume of PSW for York and Selby, it is significant. So you're nearly up to, you're just over double what you would be
Sure.
for crime.
Yeah.
Time-wise, looking at that in terms of hours and minutes of 2,613 hours, dealing with PSW, public safety and welfare calls. But if you look at the crime, so even though it's nearly double the amount of crime is taking the time to deal with. So it's still 2,017 hours to deal with half the amount of volume that's a crime, and that's because of the investigative processes, etc., that we go through. So those two areas.
But they also, effectively longer term. So, well, does that hours? That's just covering. Is that time?
This
spent?
is how we're responding to the initial incidents. So what we would say is an officer goes status 6, which is where you've attended the incident, until they go what we call status 2, which is when they come free to go to the next incident.
Yeah, so if that crime is then allocated to an investigator, and
There's
they
even more
spend
time.
several weeks investigating it
That's not.
by taking statements,
Yeah.
etc., it's not on there. And this is the whole discussion we have on a regular basis about the activity-based costing that we used to do, because you would actually be able to measure the total cost and time taken to investigate a crime,
Which
because
crime would be
investi-
bigger in that respect.
yeah,
Yes.
so investigators used to fill the boxes in, everybody used to fill the box, so you could tell by adding all of those things up exactly how long it took to investigate a crime, right across from response to investigation to
Sure.
people attending court, etc.
And again, reflective in ASB in the sense, someone will probably turn up, have a word with whoever, group of children or adults or whatever they're doing, and say, please stop it, and they stop it. So
Yes,
it's
you
really
look
quick.
at the time.
Exactly, it's a really quick.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
PCSOs.
Yeah.
Go on.
No problem.
So they look like they're getting dispatched to a lot of incidents,
Yeah.
whereas neighbourhood policing officers aren't.
Well,
I
it's
just
that-
wondered whether
It's the volume. So that doesn't give you the percentage of neighbourhood policing officers to the percentage of PCSOs. So obviously far fewer neighbourhood policing constables than there are PCSOs. So you've got to extrapolate that up to a percentage wise.
Okay. I wonder whether, because what this doesn't show, especially for the public, and given the emphasis we put on neighbourhood policing in North Yorkshire, neighbourhood policing teams obviously do an awful lot more than response. They do very little response,
Yeah.
technically, don't they? I wonder whether there's a way that we can show the work that neighbourhood policing teams are doing in a similar way, and that might be a real challenge for Mark, because
Yes,
that
it
data doesn't
If you
necessarily
had
exist.
activity-based costing,
Well,
you could fill in
exactly,
those
yeah.
little boxes, but actually they told you an awful lot about exactly what
So,
people
I
were
think
doing
Yeah.
with their
I-
team.
If that is the only way we would capture that with neighbourhood policing teams, because it is a lot of their work is not captured on Storm or radio. So
But we have talked about, very briefly with Mark Bakes, about how we use our mobile working terminals in the same way that legal services have just done a whole piece of work around measuring what their activity time is spent doing. Whether you can have a touch button app where you can measure what you're doing at each hour. So if they go to a community meeting, they press start, and when they leave the community meeting, they press stop, and we'll be able to add all that data, for example.
Okay. Also on dispatches by resource type, just city versus coast. I don't know if this is merely reflective of the amount of dispatches in total, but there seem to be more PCSO dispatches in city and county than coast. It's about half in coast.
yeah, and I don't know whether that's down to the numbers or
Yeah.
whatever. I don't know.
Okay.
So
Because it. Okay.
But correspondingly, they have more MPT.
Yes. And so it's whether that's reflective of the nature of crime in those areas. It begs more questions. Isn't it?
One of our pieces of feedback, I think, is going to be about using the same scales as well, because the other thing we have to take into account is that on city and county, the bars are 0 and 1,000, whereas on so it doesn't.
It's not
When you
comparable.
look at it, it doesn't really compute. But
but you get the same. It's the same theme for all three commands, which is it's crime and PSW taking our time.
We've managed to change the colours.
Yes.
But the
Sarah,
colours
we
are
are
great now. Yeah.
doing it iteratively, bit by bit. The colours are right now, we just need to change the scale.
Nexus,
really
Nexus is
interesting.
doing a great job since they replaced the superintendent that was in there. That's all I can say. So they're the three command areas. So they're pretty much similar. It's a similar theme for all three, really. So I'll canter through that.
Yeah.
Mental health is the next slide that we've got up in relation to this. I think what's really interesting in relation to that, so for April for us, 31, nearly 32% of our concern for safety had a mental health tag to it. Nearly 40% of domestic incidents had a mental health tag attached to them, and 30% of our missing from home incidents had a mental health tag. So again, it's just really highlighting the types of incidents that are coming through, we're seeing a mental health marker against those specific areas of business. I think, and that's an opportunity for us, I think, to think about how can we work more closely with our partners in health and adult social care, children's social care, to look at how could we start to manage that demand area.
It seems odd that they're really high percentages. Doesn't reflect on more than 9% of the overall.
Well, I was just about to ask, what's the difference between a mental health qualifier and a mental health tag?
So the tag is just what is placed on niche for an individual. So that might be that they've declared to the officer when they've gone that they've got a mental health issue. It might be the officer feels that there's a mental health issue relating to that incident. It's not necessarily clinical.
No, of course.
So a tag has to be a clinical assessment.
No, the tag isn't.
The tag
Tag
is
is-
on niche against the
Yeah.
person.
Is the qualifier the same thing?
The
That's a
qualifier
different
is
word
the-
for the same thing.
No, the qualifier is the storm. So the command and control program used in the control room when the control room open or close an incident, they will place a qualifier on it to say whether or not they feel there's been a mental health element to that incident. Now, the two don't always correlate because the officer may make a decision that the control room's not aware of.
No, because I was going to say there's about 3,500 incidents with a mental health tag
Yeah.
and only 1,400, 1,500 with
Yes,
a mental
and
health
I think that's
Yeah.
about us getting our data sets more aligned with the control room saying they felt that there was a mental health qualifier, and an officer dealing with it probably has come along afterwards and put a tag on a person on niche. So that wouldn't then they wouldn't then go back and put a qualifier on that.
So the difference is persons and incidents.
Yes,
rather than
yes, and I think the issue for me is actually the ones with the amount of people with a mental health tag that we should be looking at in terms of actually they're the ones that our officers are engaging on a day-to-day basis at these types of incidents.
And there's two things. Command and control on Storm, you're less likely to get a qualifier because it's potentially shorter amount of time with which to understand that, whereas a mental health tag, you've got a longer
Yes.
period with which to identify that, and therefore it's probably more.
And they're also related to individuals as opposed to just the incident.
Yes.
So it might be not police.
Yeah.
Do you, on the second box, is that 31% of 1,138 for the top line, or is it 31% meaning 1,138?
31% of our concern for safety traps injured incidents for April were linked to an individual with a mental health tag. So it's 31% of those over incidents. So the number of incidents we dealt with for concern for safety, 1,138. Of that 1,138, 31% had a mental health tag.
So it's not 3,500, it's much less than that. That's slightly confusing.
Right.
But we'll
We
pick that
need,
with
but
Mark.
yeah,
So it should be, so that number, if you were relating to mental
I
health,
thought
would
the
be about
31% was 1,100.
would be about 40,
Yeah.
400.
Can I just go in
That's
as a
right.
bracketed number?
Yes.
Yeah, we could do that. I can ask them
Well,
to.
that's how we
it needs to be
Ask them to
explained,
clarify
doesn't
that.
it, so that people know what the context is.
Yeah.
Can I, just to, in the interest of time, my at Scarborough Street Triage seems to have fallen off a cliff, a bit like York did about 6 months ago. That was something to do with the reprovision of the street triage team,
Yeah.
Yes.
which got
So-
was a known problem that they knew there'd be a dip and it would go
And
back.
availability.
So this month's numbers, which I've got, because you didn't have them in time for the presentation, it's 60 for April for Scarborough. So it's gone back, it's gone up again to what, probably just under what the December 17 numbers were.
Still seems odd, I have to say. That it would go dip so low to be a third of cases and then back up back up half to 60.
Unless it was availability of staffing.
Yeah, so but
For
could
example.
we
We
naturally
need
try
to
and
Yeah,
understand why.
yeah, and also we've got to think about as well whether or not the street triage team were able to deploy in
Absolutely.
bad weather. So we've got to
Sure,
look at
understood,
some of those as well,
understood.
so.
And Jenny had the answer last time, so it might be worth asking Jenny
Yeah.
as an action. But it might well again be a planned issue that they're sort of providing something
Yeah.
in another
Yeah,
way. But it
yeah.
just seems
Yeah.
odd.
So the other figure that I've asked Helen to look at is this one just shows you the street triage on the ground. Actually, it's the force control mental health triage
Absolutely.
is a different figure as well.
Yeah.
So in April there were 299 referrals made to the mental health triage and the force control from our incidents as well. So I think we probably need to have a look at both in comparison, because actually the more they use the ones in the force control room, the less you're going to deploy
Yeah.
the street triage. So
And
there's a combination of figures.
I know the mental health nurse in the control room is extremely well appreciated, and I think I'm right in saying I don't know if contract's the right word, but the amount of time they spend in the control room, which is already significant, I think 10 to 10, or maybe more than that, 7 days a week or something.
Yeah.
But thinking about extending that, because I think the feedback from the nurses is they often get downtime to look at some cases in more detail, which again helps the cops on the ground rather than just responding to on the spot.
Yeah, so I think we need to take the two in
Yeah.
collectively really to see what the impact of that is. Sorry, keep going through for speed. So the interest in relation to this one, this is our section 136, so where somebody is detained under a Mental Health Act by a police officer. This breaks that down for the month of April. There was 25 incidents. The 14 figure for Harrogate is misleading. Harrogate took 5 of York's because there was no space in York, so it looks like Harrogate's had quite a high hit, but it hasn't. It took 5 individuals from York on a transfer.
And that took right, I see.
So in total times then, so for 25 incidents in April, we spent 241 officer hours dealing with 25 incidents related to section 136 mental health. Of those 25 incidents, 10 of those were transported in a police vehicle and not an ambulance.
14 ambulances.
So
Outrageous.
what we don't know obviously is whether or not how many of those were violent, how many of those were linked to criminal offences as well, so there's more detail in relation to that. But these are just indicators for me, so there's a significant number of hours. 119 officers used for 25 incidents, taking up 241 hours of time.
And when it says 9 hours per job on average, which is that a shift almost?
Essentially what you lose is one officer from the force each day of the month in April to deal with mental health, 136.
Yes. So it says average time per job, and then we've got total officers just beneath. So that's not 119 officers doing 9 hours on average. Is it?
No, it's average officers used per job is 4.8. So and it's 9 hours.
But they're not all spending 9 hours. They're
not all
swapping over or whatever it might be. Or are they?
No, well that's what that's showing us is so for example if there were 2, it would be a minimum, if we're transporting those, it would be a minimum of 2 officers to transport. If they go to a 136, so those officers are staying there. So the average, so we are losing 241 hours of officer time. We lost in total 241 hours of officer time in April for that. Now some of that is absolutely necessary, but I think what we've got to start to look at here is how much of that we need to work with our partners to reduce that number down, and or understand actually is there an alternative solution for us to put in place to free those officers up.
Well, absolutely. So I know Julia, as co-chair of the Crisis Care Concordat, is again raising with Yorkshire Ambulance Service the 10, on this occasion, 10 transportations in a police vehicle, which is just unacceptable generally. On the officers per job, that doesn't mean 5 on average are there for the whole duration. Would that be, there might be some arresting officers and then they are transported by another group and therefore it's 5 in total. There aren't 5 officers.
That would be taken off the storm or rotate,
Yes.
collar numbers on the storm.
Yeah, that's what they've done. So they've taken that
the
off,
overall involvement in
and
that.
what they've done is taken the total number of jobs, the total number of hours, and divided that to get your average. So it's an average.
So just doing the same is interesting. This is based on the county response times. For each section 136 is 3 times as long as they spend on a crime, and 5 times as long as they spend on a PSW. So that is a significant. They could have dealt with 3 crimes in the time that they've dealt with one section.
Yeah, and I don't think it would be unusual sometimes where officers you'd lose your officers for a shift at times. So I think there's some work for us to do around that. So this one is crimes by district comparators. Again, looking at here, the changes to crime data integrity and the legislation mean that we're probably going to anticipate this year about a 25% rise in reported crime. So it's not necessarily that we're going to see a difference in actual crime that takes place on the street. We need to understand and this is the work that Nexus is doing for me around understanding what that rise is going to look like. So we can talk, I'll show you in a bit more detail around burglary, how the change in legislation as recording standards has changed in terms of how we've recorded that and when we've seen the difference. But if we understand that potential for 25% increase, then we can then extrapolate that out and have a look at what's our actual on-the-street crime looking like going up in relation to rises. So again, one of the areas for me is around violence offences. That's significantly going up, but then we're anticipating a 20% increase because we've changed how we record harassment and stalking. So actually 20% of that increase in violence offences we would take out from recording those crimes better. So those crimes were already taking place, we didn't record them at the proper time.
So sorry, stalking harassment, they would come under violence offences?
Yes.
Right.
It's violence without injury.
Yeah, that's broken down, that category, so that's just that's a broad heading.
Even if it's stalking without the threat of violence or harassment without the threat of violence?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
harassment comes into that, so I can probably explain that.
No, that's
Can I, just on that, just back to the previous slide, Phil, I know I'm conscious of time. Drug offences, 50% increase or so. Is that a general sort of reflection of the county lines work?
So again, yeah, lots of proactive work around. You certainly saw on that previous slide the work that's going into tackling county lines and tackling the drugs offences. You will see that's a significant rise in relation to drugs offences there.
We've got the drugs come to later. We do.
Yeah.
Can I, and sorry, just for clarity's sake, under volume of historic recorded crimes, should I presume that where the date committed was more than 12 months before it was reported? Because it says less than 12 months there, but I think it should be more than 12 months.
Yeah, historic crime is
So
longer
yes.
than 12 months.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, some of that we're starting to see. So this is anecdotal. Speaking to the DCI in York, actually in terms of that historical rapes exceptions, that was starting to see that spike slowing in that area, but the reported rapes is still anticipated to increase in terms of within the non-historic cases. So this is crime trends again. So if you look at the top corner there, that shows you when the legislation changed.
Yeah.
So you can see the spike that you've got in your reported residential burglaries as a result of the change in legislation. So this is showing what the impact of these types of changes will have in relation to it.
And if you club those together to just burglary, it's about steady.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just the way that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You see, so you see a drop in non-residential and a significant rise in residential. It's because it then includes sheds. And
Sure.
things like that.
On possession of weapons, is that anything to do with county lines? Because that can come with violence.
There will be an element within county lines. So we
Yeah.
are seeing more weapons offences because of the links to county lines.
Yeah.
So they are. Yeah. So whether that's
Without getting too obsessive and finical about the thing, of course, there
Get
is.
obsessive if you like, Fraser.
But there's weapons legislation is all over the place, as is most legislation. But there are some where if you have simply made use of something because it's handy, there's one type of route that it goes down. But the stuff that I think is behind your question is where there is a kind of a conscious, premeditated
Yeah.
self-arming
Yeah.
with stuff
Yeah.
that is defence weapons per se, rather than just make use of something and
Yes.
walk
Yeah.
down the street.
Yeah.
You know what I'm
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about.
instantaneous.
And again, understanding, I think that, because that's the bit,
Yeah,
I think that at this level
that's the
is,
worry.
is really important, whereas the grab hold of something thing is kind of much more ad hoc, isn't it? So I think
Yeah.
it's really useful to understand, because then we'd know that thing, wouldn't we, where people have consciously self-armed
Yeah.
with something that was created
It's
in order
the
to cause harm.
it's the organised element around
Yeah.
that we're seeing that rise, connecting to those OCG organised crime groups
Yeah.
and the county lines activity that's taking place. So what I wouldn't want to do is leave the impression that we've got the same issues that London or others are facing. We don't have that issue. Ours is linked to what
Starting
we've
from
seen
a pretty
against
low base.
organised crime groups. Yeah.
Is there an understanding of whether that is a particular type of weapon? So, is it knives, guns?
Predominantly for us, it would be bladed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, because obviously the BBC did some analysis on the Home Office data that came out recently, and there was a big headline around the Home Office data anyway about the number of charges going down. Just on that, because what that showed us as part of that data was that the number of charges for robbery that's on there, and the number of charges for possession of weapon is coming down. Robbery by more than 25%, and possession of weapons by around 15-20%. Is there a particular reason why we're charging less around those crime times, even though they seem to be on the increase? That's what the Home Office data was showing now, and it might not be a question for this given the
I was
time.
going to say, I'll probably have to go and have a look into it and
Yeah.
come back to you.
Yeah, sure.
To be honest with you.
That would be good. It just seemed odd that that's what the Home Office data seemed to be, at least
Yeah.
the BBC's
The-
analysis.
A similar, we'll think about how we term it, because I've got a similar concern about, which again I think is a national rather than a North Yorkshire issue, about bail. Actually, our figures are quite good for bail as far as I'm concerned. Not that there is a definition of good, but that appears to be having an impact on the length of investigations.
There is
for
bail
example.
out stuff that's being looked into by Leanne McConnell and their team about now that people are being released under investigation.
The
rather
clock doesn't
than
run, the
bail.
pressure's not quite the same
Correct.
to resolve a crime.
Yeah, and I think there's been a national direction of
just
length of time for
understanding that.
investigation.
And on that, we've had, I would say, quite a significant rise in the number of accused ringing our office saying that they just don't know what's going on. They're
Released under investigation.
released under investigation.
But there's still a
and
cloud
there's
hanging over them.
a greater mental health impact
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
as a result.
Yeah.
Well, we'll maybe put a sort of a pack of questions together about outcome type, end of the
Yeah.
investigation rather than crime
Yeah.
occurrences.
Yeah.
I think there were always going to be some unintended consequences of the Bail Act.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think
Changes.
that always stood, but there are some forces still at sort of zero. for
There
reasons
are.
later.
I actually think the fact that we were a pilot force was a real positive for us, because I think we took
Step ahead.
we were. I think there's some in terms of the use of bail. I think there are some really good processes in place for North Yorkshire Police in terms of that. I think Leanne McConnell and CG has got
Yeah.
some really tight processes in how we use it. I think we are using that appropriately. I think one of the examples for us was a recent job in Northallerton, where actually we took a different stance to the force, and we've ended up got somebody remanded and charged as opposed to released under investigation. So I think we're quite strong in relation to that. We have applied for a number through magistrates' courts for extensions of bail. The high percentage of those have been granted. I think we've only not had 2 granted, I think it was, of those. So it's really, really good.
My concern isn't actually about bail rates.
It's
I
the
think that
release
feels
of
about right.
investigation.
It's the no, well, not necessarily. I think North Yorkshire Police seem to be good at judging when bail is necessary and when it isn't. It's more the impact, which is national, so it's only how it manifests in North Yorkshire, which I don't think is much different everywhere else. The impact that has on the investigation after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got. So the other part of work we've got going. So Leanne's looking at the release under investigations. I've also got linked in with that Inspector Mark Proctor. Inspector Mark Proctor's looking at that and how actually we apply our standards all the way through the commands down to sergeants, and how they're going to manage those PCs and investigations, and how they're keeping track of that. So there's 2 pieces of work ongoing to try and capture that.
I want to ask a question about that in the stalking presentation, but I missed the chance.
So this slide here then just it probably alludes to what the other one says. So this is looking at actually sexual offences and violent offences and where those have taken place. So we can see Scarborough Rydell area, particularly Scarborough, is a particular challenge around sexual offences for us. So again, I know the Commander Alday over there has got some focus on around that and investigations there. But the violence offences there, I've just highlighted for me, is you can see there the harassment, malicious communications and stalking offences. When you start to look at those 3 areas, they are the majority of the violence offences rises that we're seeing. So it's in that area. So actually we already think we're under-reporting.
Yeah.
So I anticipate that that's going to go up significantly, and I think it's a good thing if that does go up.
It is. It's one of the, as with domestic abuse and others, actually, it's more a reflection of confidence in policing and others that they're able to report rather than necessarily more occurrences. It's just more occurring now.
Yeah.
But also that we are more able then to make sure they've got proper support.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because that's the
Absolutely.
at the end of the day.
Yes. So I think in terms of that, that's where I see the rise in violence offences. Actually, I see that perversely as quite positive in terms of, because when you look at where they are, they're linked to what we've had the presentation.
Yeah, there are some things like burglary where generally if you burgle, you report it. If that goes up, it's an indication that burglary's gone up, where other crime going up might be a reflection of more of the being reported than the numbers of the crime going up.
Yeah. So this next slide just shows a bit of a breakdown of where within the force some of our PSW, antisocial behaviour and other incidents are taking place. But the one thing I wanted to point out on here is I've done a bit of work in terms of the figures there, and actually when you look at domestic incidents, so it's not crimes, it's domestic related incidents that we've got. Richmond and Hamilton is standing out in relation to, actually it looks like there are fewer domestic incidents reported in Richmond and Hamilton as an average across the rest of the force. So Scarborough and Rydal is a little bit of an anomaly that we would need to break apart, but when you look at the other 5 areas in the force, they're pretty much around, percentage-wise, around about the same sorts of levels. The one that does stand out is Hamilton and Richmondshire. So Hamilton and Richmondshire is a low level of reporting on a percentage average than the other 5 areas. So Alan's going to take that away and have a look at that and see whether or not there's actually anything specific around there. So whether that's linked to the military community, other communities, or what, we don't know yet. We're going to have a look at that, I think.
Sure. Interesting. I don't know the populations of York and Harrogate, but the number of PSWs seems to be a lot closer than you might expect. But
York's about 200,000 residents, but of course you get all the visitors as well.
yeah.
So that it's always difficult, isn't it, with those in terms of the tourist related and student population as well in terms of fluctuation.
Yeah, so next slide, again, you can just see different types of crime types, but particularly I think you can see, these are just areas you can see where the drugs offences are spiking, certainly Scarborough, Rydal areas. You look at, that's the ones that are linked to the county lines activity that's taking place. Again, York, you've got a spike in the violence areas for us. Again, looking at, actually there's some links there to nighttime economy and other things that are taking place. Again, each of the commands, I get a weekly report in relation to those, and the commanders then have their meetings with the crime commanders, and they've got problem-solving plans in place to tackle some of these areas.
2 questions. One, what does cyber mean in the context of that particular slide? Is it cyber crime? It can't be cyber-enabled crime because that would be huge, but...
No, I'll have to go away and double-check that.
And then, more generally on the slide, it isn't here, so I didn't know when to raise it. With the task force, there is the news bit, but we did have a breakdown of what they do out on per hour, a bit like the first few slides, which was missed last time, but it was sent afterwards. But if we could add it back in, the task force breakdown of what they do, because one of their surprising bits on that was the number of RTCs, road traffic accidents, they go to. And having had a very brief chat with one of the officers, I think they're relatively comfortable with that, and they're the closest there, and often they're motorcycles because it's rural, and if they didn't go and wait for someone else to go, there's a risk of life and that kind of thing. But it's just, that was quite an interesting insight that I hadn't thought they'd be doing, which they are doing. It's not that it's bad, it's just I didn't know. So having that back on would be quite helpful just to keep an eye on it.
Okay, and that's essentially it for the performance.
Thank you very much. I've asked my questions. Anybody else got any questions on that?
It was just to say that the rural task force, this is helpful. I think that was kind of from the previous type of performance track. I think what Julie was actually talking about was on the first of the new lot, there was a helpfulness table, new table.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just said that.
That's what I meant to say. Yeah, their deployment by hour as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's not in this pack, but it was in the previous pack.
Okay.
You could just get marked.
In the very first one.
In the March one, yeah.
It was sent around after the meeting last month as well as a mission, but it was not in there either. So it's
Okay, I'll pick that up.
No need to send it around again this time.
No.
For future ones.
Okay.
Yeah. It was just good to see it again because of the number of hours they spent.
Yeah, and they're one of those proactive teams that isn't reflected in the proactive bit at the beginning.
Yeah.
Because they're sort of proactive, sort of
It's
reactive. It's
half neighbourhood.
yeah. Simon,
No
any
questions.
questions?
Not even from HMI.
No, not even from Joe. So that's it. Thank you very much. Simon, is that your way of asking us to plug the Rural Crime Survey again?
Yes, it might be.
So for anyone listening, any rural residents, or any residents in fact, the National Rural Crime Network are running the National Rural Crime Survey at the moment. It's open for another 3 weeks, I think. We would really like your feedback as to what policing is like in rural areas, what's good, what's bad, what's worked, what's changed. It takes about 15 minutes, I think, to fill in, but if you go to nationalruralcrimenetwork.net, you will find it, but if you just search through internet for National Rural Crime Survey, it will crop up. Please do feedback your thoughts and concerns, and any feedback is welcome. Thank you. There is also a neighbourhood policing survey specifically for North Yorkshire, so that the Rural Crime Survey is nationwide. Here in North Yorkshire, we'll be running a neighbourhood policing survey launching tomorrow. Again, that's for feedback from what local policing feels like in North Yorkshire, be it PCSOs or neighbourhoods. But again, takes not much of your time to fill in, and it would be really helpful for us to know what your feedback is. Hopefully, you will see it tomorrow when it's launched, and it will be accessible on the PCC's website. Deep breath. Anything else? No. Any other business then, Tom? Claire?
No, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll close the meeting. Next month is drugs. So if anyone watching has an interest in how the police deal with drugs issues, please keep your eyes peeled for our website, because we'll publish that presentation about a week in advance. But your questions can start coming from now, and we'll try and get answers to those. Thank you very much.